Chapter 2205. Now that he thought about it, it was true that he hadn't had breakfast with his old man for several years. Just as he was starting to feel guilty, reality was cruel and once again proved that he had been overthinking. After slipping out of Beijing, Commander-in-Chief Xia patted his son's shoulder again and pointed out the mistakes in his words earnestly. "You're not loved by your grandparents and uncles. You've lived for almost 30 years. Why haven't you accepted reality yet? That's why I'm reminding you that it's important to stay by your wife's side. Sixth brother, just look at old Master Xia and old Madam Xia. You have a son and a daughter, right? In the end, who's going to stay by your side? Children and relatives will only drop by occasionally. The person who's going to stay by your side for the rest of your life is still the person you sleep with. The person who's going to stay by your side for the rest of your life is still the person you sleep with." Commander-in-Chief Xia never thought of restricting Xia Jinyuan. He only hoped that his only son could find true happiness. As for him, he just wanted to watch from the sidelines. Commander-in-Chief Xia couldn't bring himself to say such sentimental words. He also believed that his son knew what he meant. It could be considered as a special communication between father and son. They couldn't be too serious or too formal. Communicating through arguments was the most effective and peaceful way for a father and son to communicate. It was a valuable experience he had gained from arguing with his son over the years. Xia Jinyuan didn't say anything else. He just held his father's shoulders even tighter. He would find his own happiness. When the time came, he would bring his happiness to accompany old Master Xia, who had divorced and refused to remarry because of him. In the bathroom, Yi Qian moved quickly. From going to the toilet to washing his face and brushing his teeth, he took less than 2 minutes. He then spent another 30 seconds tidying himself up. When he opened the door and came out, he saw Xia Jinyuan pushing the door open. "Help me wipe my back." Without waiting for Yi Qian to come out, Xia Jinyuan squeezed his way in and pushed Yi Qian back into the bathroom. Old Master Xia's appetite hasn't been very good recently. He's worried that watching me eat breakfast will make him lose his appetite even more. Let's clean up before going out to accompany him. Otherwise, he'll vomit. Yi Qian knew very well how the father and son interacted with each other. When he heard that, he pursed his lips and said with a smile, "The commander-in-chief doesn't think you're dirty. He thinks you're dirty. Little fox." Xia Jinyuan, who was about to take off his clothes, paused and said meaningfully, "You can't say things that you already know. If you do, I'll lose face." Yi Qian was tidying up his toiletries with her back to him. When she turned around, she saw that his upper body was empty. Moreover, his head was lowered as he undid the belt of his hospital pants. Amid the clanging sound of toiletries falling to the ground, Yi Jian, whose reflexes were faster than her brain, grabbed Xia Xiaoyuan's trousers with the most precise speed. He was too precise, too fast, and too quick. Coupled with his overreaction, although he managed to catch the pants that were falling down, at the same time, he also caught the part that had tormented Major Xia for the entire night. It was the part that had naturally risen early in the morning, and it was the part that showed the characteristics of a man the most. Yi Qian was dumbfounded. She wanted to pull her hand back, but it was too late. Xia Jinyuan, who had a handsome face and a forbearing expression, held her right hand very tightly. She subconsciously tried to pull her right hand out, but then she saw the man, who would not even blink if Mount Tai collapsed in front of him, fiercely suck in a breath of cold air. His noble and elegant face was no longer calm. There was a prelude to a storm. Especially that pair of unfathomable dark eyes, there seemed to be something struggling inside, as if it wanted to break free. Chapter 2206. Sorry, I let go of my hand first. How could Xia Jinyuan let go of her hand? Early in the morning, the benefits suddenly came at the drop of a hat. It was really a surprise. Not only did he not let go, he laughed deeply and said, "No, you took the initiative. I can't bear to let go." That's right, the once #1 hedonistic prince in the capital was starting to act like a rogue. "I didn't do it on purpose." "You let go." Xia Jinyuan, who was tortured to the point of breathing heavily, did not stop her. He only held her hand and did not let go. His strong and muscular chest was undulating, and his smooth and beautiful muscles were stretched taut. Occasionally, one could even see his lean and beautiful chest muscles twitch. His body's most faithful reaction was not that he was being tortured, but that he was enjoying it. "You already took the initiative to molest me. It's too late to say that you didn't do it on purpose." His handsome face was enduring, and his voice was hoarse and intoxicating like red wine. "Hold on tight, little fox. But don't pull too hard. It'll be troublesome if you break it." "Yi Qian. This rogue. Don't stop. Control your strength a little and be gentler," the big bad wolf said very gently. His dark eyes, which were as deep as the sea, stared deeply at Yi Qian. It was as if there was a whirlpool in the depths of his eyes that could suck in Yi Qian's soul. Yi Qian did not dare to move. Her unintentional action had turned into her taking the initiative to molest him. Moreover, the part of molestation was so special. She could not move, could not pull away, and could not shake, but if she just held on like this, she would be embarrassed. Last time at the hotel, the two of them had a certain level of restraint. In the end, they stopped at his upper body. Although Xia Jinyuan was thinking of how to make Yi Qian study the physiological structure of his lower body, he did not have the opportunity to let her study him. Who knew that good things would happen so suddenly? He was so caught off guard that he almost missed the opportunity. Fortunately, he reacted quickly. While her attention was on the pants he was taking off, he held her hand down and completed the process of studying a man's body structure and physiological changes. He finally made up for the regret from last time. "Relax, little fox. Can you feel the changes in me?" Without being impatient, Xia Jinyuan patiently tried to lure Yi Qian. "The changes you're experiencing now or the changes I experienced last night?" Over and over again, back and forth. "Can you feel it?" He took a few steps closer to Yi Qian. Then, he pressed his waist against the basin. Xia Jinyuan pressed her hand with one hand and lowered his head to whisper into her ear, "It's a very real reaction. Baby, do you feel it?" She could feel it. The process of turning from soft to hard made her face red like it was on fire. She was so nervous that her throat tightened. Yi Qian pressed his shoulder against his chest. His voice was as soft as a mosquito's buzzing. "Captain Xia, I'll go out first. You take your time." Although she didn't have any romantic experience in her 2 lives, she more or less knew what was going on between a man and a woman. Now that the alarm was blaring, she wanted to escape. Chapter 2207. Be good. Touch it again. Touch it properly. It was in pain the whole night, and it was waiting for you to comfort it. Don't be afraid. It doesn't want you to be afraid, because it belongs to you. Do you understand? Her low and sexy voice was saying the most seductive words. It was not lewd words, but a sincere message to Yi Qian that no one else could comfort it, other than her. Nothing will happen. Touch its shape and we'll go out. Trust me, little fox. I mean what I say. Touch its shape. Yi Qian was flabbergasted. This, how could he say something like that? He looked up and glared at her. "Captain Xia, don't say something like that." He said it shamelessly, but she was embarrassed to hear it. Although she said she was glaring, in Xia Jinyuan's eyes, it was not threatening at all. Her eyes were like water, surrounded by a thin layer of mist. There was no threat, only seduction. Even her voice was soft and soft. When it fell into his heart, it caused his chest to ripple. He wished that he could rub her into his body. Although his heart was rippling, Xia Jinyuan's voice was very serious. He said, "Every object has its own shape. I'm not wrong. When you were blindfolded, didn't you have to touch the shape to determine which part to use? Mine also has a shape. Why should I be embarrassed?" When it came to being thick-skinned, Xia Jinyuan, who used to be a rich playboy in Beijing, was invincible. After his explanation, the shameful words could not be more serious. Yi Qian, who was so embarrassed that his face turned red, sighed softly and said, "You're twisting words and forcing logic." "You are indeed twisting words and forcing logic." Xia Jinyuan admitted it boldly. He pressed her hand down a little and rubbed his chin against the top of her head. He had a hard time holding himself back and said softly, "I couldn't sleep the whole night because I was thinking about whether or not I could get the attention of the mistress. I was miserable the whole night. Can you at least take pity on me, just for a little while?" "Didn't sleep the whole night?" Yi Qian looked up in disbelief. Maybe he really didn't sleep the whole night because there were faint dark circles under his eyes. When she looked up, Xia Jinyuan, who was having a hard time holding himself back, quickly kissed her lips. His dark eyes were filled with masculine emotions. "Promise me this once, okay?" Yi Qian was so nervous that he couldn't bear it any longer. He was sweating profusely. Yi Qian was so nervous that he couldn't bear it any longer. Yi Qian's heart trembled when he saw his thin lips pursed tightly together, looking at him like a child waiting for candy. He couldn't help but tighten his grip on his right hand. Yi Qian's handsome features revealed a pained yet joyful expression because of his strength. Yi Qian softly said, She was truly a seductive vixen." She looked at him with her bright black eyes, which was so seductive that he was about to go crazy. His Adam's apple moved, and the kiss became even more intense. "Good girl, my little vixen, my little baby." His voice was hoarse as he kissed her lips. His chest was filled with tenderness. Yi Qian leaned into his arms obediently and rested her head on his chest. Her slender and fair fingers were wrapped around by his large and strong hands. His trousers fell off, and her fingers and palms could feel a burning sensation that was even hotter than before. Xia Jinyuan was indeed a man of his word. He held her hand and kissed Yi Qian's cheek. Her face and his lips were burning hot. "Good girl, little vixen. Come, let's let go. Help me wipe my back." He had already let go. Yi Qian hurriedly let go half a beat later and buried her face in his chest. She was so embarrassed that she couldn't lift her head. Chapter 2208. His deep and pleasant laughter came from above. "How can you be so shy in the future? It's your first time, and it's my first time too. Actually, I'm more nervous than you. I was thinking that if you rejected me, it would really hurt my self-esteem." No matter how strong his heart was, he wouldn't be able to accept rejection and dislike. "I didn't reject you. It happened so suddenly that I was a little flustered, okay?" Yi Qian lowered her head and replied softly. At this moment, her legs were actually a little weak. She was so embarrassed that she didn't even want to raise her head. Thinking back to the accident just now, and then looking down at the part that was still standing proudly, Xia Jinyuan's eyes flickered slightly. His warm fingers gently stroked her eyebrows, and his voice was deep and sexy. "I wish that such an accident would happen a few more times. The feeling was so wonderful that I said something that went against my heart." What he meant was that he didn't want it to end at all. There won't be a next time. Give up. If such an accident happened a few more times, it wouldn't be an accident anymore. It would be intentional. The thin-skinned Yi Qian didn't want to do it a few more times at all. Moreover, the changes in his body were really terrifying. At first, it was soft like dough, but the moment she grabbed it, it became several times bigger. She could even feel the blood vessels on it through his pants. Stop, stop. I can't think about it anymore. Yi Qian, whose ears were red, said in a stern voice, turn around. I'll scrub your back. Although he didn't know what she was thinking, he knew from her expression that she must be thinking about what just happened. Xia Jinyuan handed over the towel and turned around reluctantly. She was beautiful and charming, with a hint of innocent shyness. He really wanted to eat her up. Yi Qian didn't know that the man with his back to her wanted to eat her up. The sensation of his body hadn't dissipated yet, and his palms were still scorching hot, as if they had left a mark on them. When he held the towel and wrung the warm water, the temperature of his palms was far higher than the temperature of the water. Yi Qian patted the water off his face first before helping him wipe his back. After returning to China, Xia Jinyuan washed up simply. In order to avoid the wound on his waist, he wiped his upper body with a towel and washed his lower body normally. As for his back, he really didn't care about it. The wound on his waist was too big, and a simple movement of his hand would affect the wound. How could he wipe his back? Carefully avoiding the wound on his waist, Yi Qian, whose face was red to the ears, carefully wiped his back. When the towel brushed against his skin, it was as if he was caressing it with his own hands. His heart could not calm down. Captain Xia's figure was indeed very good. His muscles were well defined but not overly muscular. His smooth lines were similar to his temperament, and he had a very attractive and elegant beauty. His bone structure was even more well proportioned. He had broad shoulders, a narrow waist, long legs, and a body as straight as a spear. Every part of him exuded the towering masculinity of a man. His facial features were already exceptionally handsome, and coupled with his perfect figure, he would attract a lot of attention no matter where he went. When his gaze landed on the white gauze, Yi Qian pursed his lips tightly. She only had a few days of vacation, and she had to return to Southern Province on Sunday. If possible, she really wanted to stay with him until his wound healed. After wiping his back 3 times, Yi Qian tapped his fingers lightly to make sure that there was no trace of sweat. Only then did he stop. Okay, turn around. I'll wipe your chest for you. Are you sure you still want to wipe my chest? Xia Jinyuan, who had nothing covering his body, smiled and turned around to face Yi Qian. Since they had the most intimate contact, he generously allowed Yi Qian to appreciate his figure more clearly, as well as the majesty of a man. Chapter 2209. Yi Qian was prepared for this. He immediately pulled down the large towel as he turned around. When he turned around, the towel covered his lower body and she couldn't see anything below his waist. Xia Jinyuan, who had turned around, wanted to strike while the iron was hot. He felt that she couldn't continue being so shy. She had to get used to it. Otherwise, he was really worried that Yi Qian would kick him off the bed because of her shyness when it was time for them to have intimate relations. Who knew that Yi Qian was prepared for this? His worries were dashed. Major Xia, who didn't show any emotion on his face, took the towel and wrapped it around his waist. He said softly, I can wash the front myself. Wash your face before you go out. Her face was still red, especially her lips, which were as red as roses. She had to cool down. There was no need to rush, no need to rush. Step by step, he patiently and methodically guided her. He needed to have a considerable amount of patience, waiting for this rather vigilant little fox to slowly fall into his net. Although they stopped exploring each other's bodies, Xia Jinyuan remained calm and aggressive. He calmly lowered his head and kissed Yi Qian's burning cheek. He smiled and said, "I'll take a cold shower first. You can go out and chat with my dad." Commander-in-Chief Xia. Yi Qian suddenly remembered that Commander-in-Chief Xia was still waiting outside. In the mirror, her face was as red as a rosy cloud. The shyness in her eyes had yet to fade. One look and it was obvious that she had just done something naughty. How could she face him like this? "Xia Jinyuan, look at you. How am I supposed to go out?" Yi Qian turned and glared at the shameless fellow. "Look at me. How am I supposed to go out like this?" Xia Jinyuan, who was holding a bath towel, looked at her and smiled. He took the towel from her hand and turned on the cold water. "I am more experienced. You just need to wash with cold water and apply it. I guarantee that your complexion will be normal and there won't be any difference." If it weren't for the fact that old man Xia was still outside, he would be happy to let her stay shy for the entire day. She was so sweet and delicious that he was deeply addicted. "After staying with you for a few nights, as long as I have the energy to take a cold shower immediately, I guarantee that I won't have any thoughts. All the blood in my body will freeze, and my mind will be extremely clear." Xia Jinyuan wrung the towel dry and applied it to Yi Qian's face. He said calmly, "Go out openly." Old Xia didn't see it with his own eyes, so he won't think too much. Commander-in-Chief Xia did not think too much about it. When he heard the sound of water, he thought that Yi Qian might be helping Xia Jinyuan wash up. He knew his son very well. Needless to say, he must be thick-skinned enough to let Yi Qian serve him in the bathroom. Commander-in-Chief Xia handed a steamed bun to Yi Qian and said earnestly, "Xiao Yi, do you still remember what Dad said? Don't let him be too complacent. He's always been a smooth talker. Now that he's injured, he'll definitely pretend to be in pain in front of you. Don't spoil him. In the past, when he was injured, he would go through it alone. Why is he so spoiled now that you're here? As a man, you must not let him be spoiled. The more a man's bones are broken, the more he can withstand it. You can't spoil him, you can't spoil him." Commander-in-Chief Xia had spent 4 years in a military unit in Xiang Province. Sometimes, he would speak in Xiang Province dialect. Spoil him in Xiang Province meant that one should not spoil him too much. Xiang Province was adjacent to Nan Province. Fujian Town's military unit also had soldiers from Xiang Province. Therefore, Yi Qian more or less knew some Xiang Province dialect. Upon hearing this, Yi Qian pursed his lips and smiled. In the past, no one came to serve him, so he could only endure it alone. Now that I'm here, I can't bear to see him endure it alone. Chapter 22:10. How could she bear to let her lover, who treated her so well, suffer by himself? How could it not hurt when such a big injury was left behind? She wasn't by his side when it hurt the most. Now that he was back and had entered the recovery period, her heart ached regardless of whether he was in pain or not. No matter how much he pampered her, she was willing to do so. He doted on her, and she naturally had to dote on him too. Commander-in-Chief Xia, who was picking up pickles with his chopsticks, paused. He was moved by Yi Qian's heartfelt words. Commander-in-Chief Xia calmly picked up a mouthful of pickles and placed it on top of the steamed bun. He smiled and said, "If both of you are fine, then there won't be any pain. As long as one of you is injured, the other must be heartbroken. So, the final solution is for both of you to be safe and not worry about each other too much." There was no father who wouldn't feel distressed when they saw their son injured. He was also very distressed. He even didn't dare to look at the injury on his son's waist. Major General Yang from the army told him that his sick son was injured again. He could clearly feel his body shaking. His heart ached when his son was injured, but this heartache had to be carefully hidden because he was the commander-in-chief. Because both father and son were soldiers, soldiers had to be aware of injuries and sacrifices. How could they always show it on their faces? His heart ached because he couldn't accompany his son, so he let Xiao Yi accompany him. With Xiao Yi accompanying him, as a father, he could rest assured. Now that he heard her words again, it actually made his eyes sting. Little brat, you're luckier than me. You have good taste. You found a wife who dotes on you and dotes on you. Don't worry, we won't let ourselves get injured easily. Captain Xia and I have already agreed that we won't let each other worry, and we won't let you worry either. The last sentence was added by Yi Qian at the last minute. At that time, the agreement, he didn't expect the commander-in-chief. How could Commander-in-Chief Xia not know? He didn't point it out, but he felt very comfortable listening to it. Her appetite wasn't very good, but with Yi Qian accompanying her, she ate 2 steamed buns, a roll, and a bowl of millet porridge. Xia Jinyuan, who came out with water vapor, raised his eyebrows and smiled when he saw this. Your appetite isn't bad, it's too good. You can eat 2 steamed buns, a roll, and a bowl of millet porridge. Aren't you afraid that you'll be full? He was worried, so he asked the guards to find a doctor. He was already 60 years old, so he had to pay attention to his health. He was in a good mood and his stomach was moving well. The doctor said that everything was fine and that they were worrying too much. You're afraid that I'll eat too much, you unfilial son. Don't you know the rules? After breakfast, Xia Jinyuan, who was lying in bed to get in 4 drip, quickly glanced at Yi Qian, who was clearing the table, and then said in a low voice, "Didn't I tell you that this matter isn't urgent? Our team is full of majors. What's the difference whether or not they get a title? They're all majors anyway. Since they've been promoted in the file, it's settled. Why bother with a ceremony?" Xia Jinyuan didn't mention this matter to Yi Qian, nor did he think of telling Yi Qian. Who knew that Commander-in-Chief Xia would say it out loud without any hint, so he almost couldn't take it back. By saying that there was no ceremony, Yi Qian, who didn't know what was going on, believed him. Chapter 22:11. Why did he reject the promotion ceremony? How could he skip such a solemn ceremony? No matter how low his voice was, she could still hear him. She had not finished packing up the things in her hands. Yi Jianjian smiled and said, "Captain Xia, I want to watch you receive your rank. Is that okay?" She looked at him with sparkling eyes. "Major to lieutenant colonel, right? You only get promoted once every few years. How can you skip the ceremony? I haven't seen you receive your rank yet." There were 3 times a soldier could show off his charisma when he enlisted. First, the first day of enlistment, when he put on his uniform. Second, the rank and gun awarding ceremony. Third, the military rank promotion ceremony. She couldn't see Captain Xiao's first day of enlistment or his rank and gun awarding. Now that she could see his military rank promotion, she couldn't miss it. You didn't attend the military rank promotion ceremony because you didn't have time. Yi Qian was very interested and couldn't help but ask another question. Actually, she also wanted to ask if it was because of the Snowfield Brigade's rules. She knew the Snowfield Brigade's rules. Before leaving the Snowfield Brigade, one's military rank would never change. For example, when Pigeon and J5 put on their uniforms, their military rank would be marked as major. If she was lucky enough to enter the Shuayu Brigade after graduation, and if she could be promoted to major in 3 years, then she would always be a major when she wore a formal uniform, and her official rank would be like Captain Xia, secretly promoted to lieutenant colonel, but still a major on the surface. She didn't quite understand why he did this. Xia Jinyuan looked at Yi Qian. He originally wanted to suppress his military rank, but after hearing Yi Qian's words, he changed his mind. Okay, I agree. Okay, come over for the meeting tomorrow. You and your comrades will be there too. Commander-in-Chief Xia nodded. He rushed over early in the morning mainly because of this matter. Since he agreed, there was no need for him to stay. He then said to Yi Qian, Xiao Yi, come over with him tomorrow. Coincidentally, the nurse in charge of giving Xia Jinyuan an anti-inflammatory drip came over. Commander-in-Chief Xia stood up to leave, and Yi Qian hurriedly stood up to see him off. If it were any other time, the commander-in-chief would definitely not allow Yi Qian to drive him. But this time, he did not refuse. Instead, he said, Xiao Yi, send him to my car. I want to talk to you on the way. All right, please. Yi Qian did not notice that the man behind him was winking at Commander-in-Chief Xia as he respectfully escorted the Commander-in-Chief out of the ward. Xia Jinyuan wanted to chase after Yi Qian, but Commander-in-Chief Xia shot him a look and he could only watch helplessly as Yi Qian left the ward. What would they say when they got out? He could more or less guess the answer. After hearing the whole story, Yi Qian's heart palpitated. She had no idea that Captain Xia could have been promoted to lieutenant colonel last year, but he had been holding back because he wanted to be promoted at the same time as her. Sixth brother is very stubborn. I was very worried before I came here, but who knew that you could change his mind with just a few words? Xiao Yi, I'll leave the important task of disciplining sixth brother to you from now on. If he does anything wrong, you can discipline him well. If anything happens, I'll take responsibility. Yi Qian, whose heart had already flown back to the ward, calmed his palpitations and nodded solemnly. Don't worry, I'll definitely see to it that he's promoted to lieutenant colonel. I'll never allow him to delay something as important as his promotion because of me. She was very touched. Her man had secretly done many things for her that she didn't know about. Every one of them could shock her for a long time. For her, he had sacrificed too much. How could he accept that even his military career would be delayed by her? Chapter 22:12. There was a lot to talk about, so Commander-in-Chief Xia did not take the elevator. Instead, he took Yi Qian and the guards from the 8th floor to the 1st floor. The guards in front turned on the sensor lights and kept 8 steps away from Commander-in-Chief Xia. This way, they could keep an eye on their surroundings and not disturb the conversation between the Commander-in-Chief and Yi Qian. When it came to business, the Commander-in-Chief's voice was very serious. I'm relieved to have you with me. The conferment of ranks is not a small matter, but it is related to your future promotion, experience, and qualifications. After all, the two of you can't stay in the special forces forever. When you reach a certain age, you will retire to the second line. At that time, your qualifications and experience will be related to your promotion. Don't force or snatch things that don't belong to you. However, if it's something that belongs to you, you have to hold on to it. It's related to your future and you can't let your guard down. Sixth brother doesn't have much ambition. He can stay in the special forces for the rest of his life. He really likes his current profession and is willing to dedicate his life to it. However, Xiao Yi, even if I support your decision, the two of you can't stay in the special forces forever. I also have my own selfish motives. I hope that the two of you can go further and wider on this road. Your promotion will affect your future military career. Xiao Yi, I hope you can understand your father's arrangement. Yi Qian not only understood, but he also fully supported it. She was very touched by Xia Jinyuan's sacrifice, but the price was too high. It was too high for her to bear. How could he give up his promotion because of her? How could she become a stumbling block to his future? Back in the ward, Yi Qian saw that the man who had not slept all night had closed his eyes and seemed to have fallen asleep. He did not go in immediately. Instead, he stood quietly at the door and gazed at him gently. "Captain Xia, you've done so much for me. I can only use my life to accompany you. You're holding back your promotion because I once said, as long as you wait for me, I will definitely catch up with you. That's why you're holding back your promotion. Back then, you said those words before our relationship was clear. At that time, you remembered them in your heart and put them into action. Captain Xia. How can I not love you deeply? How can I not spoil you, indulge you, and let you do whatever you want? Why aren't you coming in? My dad must have told you about my promotion." Xia Jinyuan opened his eyes and looked at her gently. "Come here and lie on the bed with me." Yi Qian closed the door and hugged his arm as he lay there quietly. After a while, he said softly, "Captain Xia, don't stop for me. I'll try my best to catch up with you. I'll try my best to be by your side. Yes, I won't do it again." He lowered his head and kissed the top of her head. The tough soldier's heart was as soft as water. "I will always walk in front so that you can see me. I won't get lost. Okay, remember what you said today. Never stop because of me. I'm very touched, but I don't like it. I don't want to be your hindrance, I just want to be your motivation. I will definitely catch up to you. You said that we will walk side by side. You must believe that I have the ability to walk side by side with you. Okay. Yes, I've always believed in my little fox." Xia Jinyuan closed his eyes and spoke softly. He was a little tired. As he spoke, his eyes became heavy and his voice became lower and lower. Chapter 22:13. Yi Qian knew that this was the effect of the sleeping medicine. Before the commander-in-chief got into the car, he told her that he had spoken to the doctor and prescribed some sleeping medicine. This was good. He would be able to have a good night's sleep. Yi Qian, who was not sleepy, picked up a military book and slowly flipped through it. From time to time, she would look up to see if the drip bottle was still empty. She listened to the ticking sound of the clock ticking as she enjoyed their time together. When Li Jinyan arrived, he saw a scene that even he could not bear to disturb. He paused for a moment, then took out an old photo from his pocket and glanced at it. A strange light flashed across his cold eyes as he raised his hand and gently knocked on the tightly shut door. Yi Qian was a little surprised to see him. They had just met yesterday. With Li Jinyan's busy schedule, he did not have much time to come to the hospital. Yi Qian gently moved Xia Jinyuan's long arm away from her waist and quietly got out of bed. Li Jinyan pointed outside, motioning for her to come out and talk. Yi Qian closed the door and smiled naturally. "Are you on annual leave? Why are you so free?" "I'm not on vacation. I'm here for a meeting to get promoted like him." Li Jinyan's cold eyes had an unusual light smile. It was very gentle, but there was a deeper meaning behind it. "You'll be there tomorrow, right?" He had specially come to look for her. Even if he was not free, he had to squeeze in some time. Upon hearing this, Yi Qian's smile deepened. "Captain Xia told me that you were officers from the same period. You even participated in military training together. After that, you went to the Navy, and he went to the Army. I didn't expect you to get promoted at the same time. Fate runs deep. My fate with you runs deeper." Hearing her words, Li Jinyan's cold, handsome face had a deep smile. His gaze was fixed on the face in front of him. He slowly said, "Besides the fate of fighting side by side, Yi Qian, we have an even deeper fate." "An even deeper fate?" Yi Qian did not understand. "What do you mean by an even deeper fate?" Look at this picture. Taking out the old photo from his pocket, Junyan's cold face softened a little. You must know her and be very familiar with her, right? It wasn't a question, but a certainty. Yi Qian was stunned when she took the photo. Of course, she recognized the woman in the military uniform in the photo. That was her mother. Her mother had sacrificed herself when she was very young. Why was her mother's photo in Li Jinyan's hands? Why would there be such a photo? Li Jinyan handed the photo over and stared intently at Yi Qian, afraid that he would miss the slightest expression on her face. When he saw the shock on her face the moment she saw the photo, Li Jinyan knew that he was too excited. He was a steady and calm person. No matter how big the matter was, he would not be affected by it. However, this matter had stirred up great waves in his heart. Even his voice was not as cold as usual. Instead, it was calm and had some fluctuations. You look very similar to the woman in the photo. From the first time I saw you, I felt an indescribable sense of familiarity towards you. It was as if I had seen you somewhere before, but I didn't have a deep impression of you. When I found this photo, I knew where I had seen you before. It turns out that the woman in the photo is your mother. Li Jinyan was already very good at controlling his emotions, so he only revealed a little. He did not suddenly reveal the truth. Instead, as he spoke, he observed Yi Qian's expression and slowly told her the truth. Chapter 22:14. Yi Qian's expression changed drastically. In the photo, a young man and woman were cuddling together, wearing old military uniforms. Their heads were leaning against each other. It looked like they were taking a wedding photo. The thought flashed through her mind, but she instinctively chose to avoid it. She chose not to think too deeply about it. Impossible, it's impossible. It's definitely not what I'm thinking. Yi Qian, who was in an uproar, suppressed his doubts and looked up. His eyes were cold as he asked calmly, "Why do you think the woman in the photo is my mother?" Her reaction was a little unusual. Li Jinyan frowned slightly and looked at Yi Qian with a sharp gaze. When she took the photos just now, her reaction was not the same as when she was talking to him now. She was obviously shocked, but now she appeared very calm. Was she testing him? Or did she not want to know who her father was at all? Li Jinyan's eyes darkened when he remembered that her father's name was Yi Xinfan in her file. However, he couldn't blame Yi Qian. If his aunt hadn't told Yi Qian about her identity, she wouldn't have known that her biological father was someone else. Yi Qian, she is indeed your mother. Don't you even know your own mother? Li Jinyan realized how tricky the situation was when she refused to acknowledge her own mother. If he told her the truth, she would definitely deny it. This was not the result he wanted. The young woman in the photo was his aunt, whom his grandfather's family had never met. The young man was his uncle, who had only returned to his grandfather's family when he was 10 years old. Li Jinyan, who had deep feelings for his grandfather's family, didn't dare to tell Yi Qian the truth because he didn't know what Yi Qian was thinking. He was afraid that if he said it, it would make it harder for Yi Qian to accept it and push her further away. No, that's impossible. Yi Qian didn't even want to take the photo anymore. He quickly stuffed the photo into Li Jinyan's hands like a hot potato and smiled faintly. Captain Li, there are all kinds of strange things in this world. It's normal for them to be similar. I admit that the woman in the photo does look like my mother, but she's not my mother. You're mistaken. I believe you've seen my file. I have my own parents, but they're both dead. Captain Li, you've got the wrong person. Li Jinyan didn't expect her reaction to be so calm. It was as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over his heart, and he became calmer. He slowly put the photo back into his pocket. Just this small action showed how much he treasured this photo. Her reaction was too big. It was not a reaction that she could not accept, but a reaction of disgust. How could he be disgusted? Even if they didn't know each other, they wouldn't hate each other. He was too reckless. He didn't investigate the matter thoroughly before suddenly telling her. Originally, he wanted to tell Xia Jinyuan about it first. However, when he saw Yi Qian, he thought about his grandfather, who was old and couldn't go anywhere. He thought about his grandmother, who passed away with regrets. Then he thought about his mother, who didn't forget to tell him something before she passed away. No matter how calm he was, he couldn't help but feel emotional. Last night, he went to his grandfather's house and played a game of chess with his grandfather. His grandfather, who used to face all kinds of mental and physical blows, sighed to him, "The light of the mulberry elm doesn't shine far. I hope the light of the morning sun is as bright as the time." That moment made him feel sad. Li Jinyan stopped Yi Qian, who was about to go back to the ward. He said calmly, "Yi Qian, can you listen to a story? A story from a long time ago. Can you listen to it before you leave?" Chapter 22:15. The story was too complicated. It was filled with the grief of the parents and how hard life was at that time. Li Jinyan wanted to tell Yi Qian. He wanted her to change her mind after hearing the story. The story is a little long. It's related to a few old people. It might take about half an hour. Please give me half an hour and let me finish, okay? Yi Qian wasn't just resistant. She resisted until now and didn't want to hear a single word from Li Jinyan. Her eyes were cold as she said, "I don't want to hear it. I'm not interested." "Let go, Captain Li. Why won't you listen? Is it because you already have the answer in your heart? Is that why you don't want to listen?" Li Jinyan did not let go. From her eyes, he saw not only disgust, but also sadness and hatred. She really should hate it, because no one knew that her aunt was pregnant with her uncle's child before she left. Yi Qian looked at him calmly. "Captain Li, why should I listen? The story you want to tell has nothing to do with me. Why should I listen? Why should she listen to a story that had nothing to do with her? Her father was Yi Xinfan. There was no one else. If you're here to visit Captain Xia, you'll have to come back later. He needs to rest." "I'm sorry, I can't accompany you." She refused to talk about this topic. Li Jinyan saw that she was so insistent. A trace of sadness flashed across his cold face. Then he stepped aside and said calmly, "I'm sorry to disturb you. That's because you're too similar to my aunt and my uncle. My grandfather's family has never seen my aunt, and this is the only photo my aunt left of my uncle. Before my grandmother died, she grabbed my mother's hand, hoping that my mother would bring my aunt home. Unfortunately, my mother couldn't find my aunt until she passed away. I'm sorry. I was too anxious and disturbed you." Yi Qian, who was holding the door lock, paused. She turned around and nodded slightly at Li Jinyan. "It's okay. That's right. My aunt's name is very different from your mother's name. Maybe I really made a mistake." Li Jinyan took out the photo again and flipped it over to look at the bottom of the photo. The name Hong Mei was written on it with a fountain pen. He looked at it for a while, and just as Yi Qian pushed the door open and returned to the ward, he said softly, "Our whole family only knows that aunt's name is Hong Mei, but we don't even know her surname." "No, that's not right. You don't even know my mother's real name. Hong Mei is just her code name. Like you, her code name is Devil, and like me, her code name is Qing Miao. You don't even know my mother's real name. That man clearly didn't want to marry my mother." After closing the door, Yi Qian was expressionless. He didn't even mention his mother's name to his family. When he left, he didn't even say goodbye to his mother. He just left silently. It was obvious that the man only wanted to play with his mother's feelings. She knew that she wasn't her father's biological daughter. She knew that her mother was already pregnant when she married her father, but so what? Her father's name was Yi Xinfan. He was a simple and honest farmer who had doted on her when she was young. Li Jinyan left. His tall and straight back showed a hint of sadness. He was sad for the past, sad for his grandfather's family. They didn't know that his aunt had given birth to his uncle's child. No one knew, including his uncle. Chapter 22:16. Yi Qian's reaction was a huge blow to Li Jinyan. He immediately woke up from his excitement and stopped talking. He was too anxious just now. He was so anxious that he did not have the evidence to prove that Yi Qian was his uncle's daughter. However, he did not regret it. His grandfather did not have much time left. The light of the mulberry elm does not shine far. I hope the morning sun shines brightly. This was the old man's helplessness. It was also a knot in his heart that he could not let go of for the rest of his life. The old man often said that the ancestors of the Fu family had enjoyed too much and had used up all the good fortune of their descendants. In the end, only one son and one daughter grew up. The first son was his uncle. He only returned to his grandfather's side when he was 10 years old. The second daughter was his mother. She was frail and sickly. She married into the Li family less than 10 years ago and left him sick when he was 8 years old. Fortunately, he had the support of his grandmother. His grandmother, who had lived a rough life, had someone to rely on before she died. Li Jinyan thought about his elderly grandfather and his cousin who he had found. He walked out of the hospital and drove straight to his grandfather's house. Li Jinyan's grandfather was one of the leaders in the development of space, satellites, and missiles. He had laid the foundation for China's strategic missile and led China's national defense technology industry on the right track. Now, he was respectfully called Old Master Fu. Mencius. There was a book in the book, the scholar is old, so he is called master. After thousands of years, the meaning of the word master remained unchanged. It represented strength of character, spirit, heritage, and ideology. Old Master Fu's spirit was not what it used to be. He had suffered too much when he was young. Later, he worked so hard for China's space, satellites, and missiles research that his hair turned white before he was 50 years old. Although he had retired, there were still many guests at his house. They were all scientists in China's space, satellites, and missiles research. Li Jinyan drove over. The housekeeper who was in charge of taking care of Old Master Fu's daily life said softly, "There are 2 guests from the aerospace department who are discussing problems with Old Master Fu in the study. I'm afraid you will have to wait for a while." "Okay, there is no need to disturb Old Master." Li Jinyan closed the door softly and changed into home shoes. The country took very good care of retired scientists. Their food, clothing, housing, and transportation were all top-notch. Old Master Fu liked ancient architecture, so the place where he lived was near a mountain and a river. His furniture and flooring were all made of solid wood, and the interior was decorated in Han style. Walking in was like traveling to another time and space, and when sitting by the window, one could hear the sound of the wind blowing the leaves. After entering the house, Li Jinyan pushed open the wooden sliding door and found a few old photo albums in a row of bookshelves. He sat cross-legged on a thin cushion and slowly flipped through the albums. The album recorded the lives of Old Master Fu and Old Madam Fu, as well as the changes in the Fu family's wealth. Old Master Fu and Old Madam Fu were born in a wealthy family. Both of them were smart and studious. They studied abroad and graduated from MIT and became lovers. Before they were 28 years old, they lived a rich life. From 28 to 35 years old, they faced many difficulties. But no matter how difficult their life was, old Madame Fu insisted on taking a family photo every year. The family photo started with one child, then slowly increased to 2 children, then to 3 children, then to 4 children. Li Jinyan's thin lips gradually tightened because he knew that when he flipped to the next page, the 4 children would be reduced one by one until only his maternal grandfather and his pregnant grandmother were left. 3 uncles and 1 aunt, who he did not have the chance to meet, died one by one because they were homeless and had no money to treat their serious illnesses. Chapter 22:17. After Old Master Fu finished his discussion with the 2 scientists from the Aerospace Institute, he walked to his room with his cane. He had suffered a lot when he was young and had to work day and night after he entered the Aerospace Institute. Now that he was old, he could not walk properly. He even had to use a cane to walk at home. Li Jinyan was resting with his eyes closed. When he heard the door open, he opened his eyes and got up quickly. "Take your time." He helped the old man into the house and helped his gray-haired grandfather to sit down. "You're getting on in years, so you shouldn't worry too much about the Aerospace Academy. Don't worry too much, or your body won't be able to take it." Old Master Fu patted his only grandson on the back of his hand and said kindly, "I don't worry about it. I just talk to him occasionally. Once you're free, if your brain doesn't work and you're lucky enough to get rusty, you might as well use your brain while you can." The old man sat down and saw the photo album on the low table. It had been a long time, and the corners of the photo album were yellowed. Although it was cloudy, it was still full of wisdom. His skinny hand trembled as he touched the cover of the photo album. His face was so old that it had brown age spots, and there was a hint of sadness that could not be dissolved. "Ever since your grandmother passed away, I rarely look at it." Old Master Fu sighed. The photo album contained memories of his life and the sadness that he could not erase. He was born into a rich family. Even though he had a butler and 2 servants to serve him when he was in the United States, he was tortured and almost died under the bullets of the United States several times in order to serve his country. When they finally returned to the country, they were forced to leave the Aerospace Academy before they had the chance to show off their skills. Between the ages of 28 and 35, he and his wife had 3 sons and 1 daughter who died one after another. They had experienced all the misery of the world. Old Ancestor Fu had enjoyed too much in the past. All the retribution of his ancestors had been inflicted on his children. There were several times when he and his wife wanted to tie a hemp rope to a tree and wrap it around their necks. They might as well go. However, when they thought about how their motherland was in dire straits, with no space, missiles, or satellites, they couldn't bear to leave just like that. There were several times when they hugged their heads and cried. After crying, they wiped their tears and continued to draw all kinds of blueprints in silence. They lived underground and used the simplest materials to complete the simplest experiments. Flipping open the photo album, the old man's gaze landed on the photo of his smiling wife. He smiled and said to Li Jinyan, "When your grandmother was young, she was a beauty within a 10-mile radius. The number of people who wanted to marry her could line up to the city gates of Yangzhou. Her aloof temperament had countless suitors overseas." Recalling his wife, the smile on the old man's face was very soft, and there was a little bit of light in his wise eyes. "Your mother looks like your grandmother, and you also look like your grandmother. Ignorant of worldly affairs." "Grandfather, are you making fun of me?" Li Jinyan was afraid that he would make the old man too sad. It was rare for him to make fun of himself. "If I become aloof, then you'll be worried. You're afraid that I'll become a monk." Old Master Fu laughed. "You're not much different from a monk now. You're so young and always have a cold face. Any girl who sees you will be scared. When your mother was alive, she often told me that it's not a good thing to be young and mature. She was afraid that you would be too cold and would be easily taken advantage of. Your grandmother and I were also worried, but then we saw that you were smart and we knew that it was unnecessary. Chapter 22:18. At the mention of his daughter who had passed away, the old man's smile faded. Your mother was weak when she was young. It was your grandmother and I who mistreated her and caused her to pass away early. If you say that, Mom would be sad if she was still alive. Li Jinyan pursed his lips and looked at the old man with a steady gaze. Mom never thought that you and grandmother mistreated her. If it weren't for you two protecting her, I might not even exist in this world. Your mother was considerate since she was young. The old man's withered fingers gently caressed his daughter who had passed away almost 20 years ago. Tears were already glistening in his eyes. Your mother, your uncle, they suffered too much with us. Li Jinyan raised his hand and gently wiped the tears from the corners of the old man's eyes. His grandfather and grandmother had suffered too much, but they still contributed to the country without any complaints or regrets. This was something he admired very much. The old man and his grandmother's 3 sons and 1 daughter died one after another. When his wife was 37 years old, she gave birth to another daughter, Jinyan's mother, Fu Yufan. Their life had been stable for less than 2 years, but then there was a storm. Because the Fu family was suddenly reported for harboring evil intentions, the Fu family, who had finally found a place to live, was in trouble again. Old Master Fu's youngest sister and the only daughter of the Fu family, Miss Fu, got married in a hurry. Half a year later, Old Master Fu gave his 1-month-old son, Fu Yusheng, to his sister's family. Originally, he wanted to go back and pick him up after the chaos, but he didn't expect that his youngest son, Fu Yusheng, would be left with his sister's family until he was 4 years old. Later, his sister's family broke off contact, and he also lost contact with his only son, Fu Yusheng. It wasn't until Fu Yusheng was 10 years old that he was found and brought back to his side. Yusheng. I only wanted Yusheng to be safe, but in the end, I didn't want them to be safe. The old man flipped through the photo album page by page. When he saw his 3 sons and 1 daughter who died young and his youngest daughter who died young, his heart was heavy. When he saw a handsome young man with dashing eyebrows and bright eyes, the old man sighed from the depths of his chest. It was so heavy that the air seemed to freeze. Jinyan, uncle hasn't been home for 4 years. I don't know why, but I keep thinking about him. This was his only son who had grown up and was also the only child who was still alive. His lifeless voice trembled a little. I don't know if I can wait for him to come back. After saying that, the old man coughed deeply. At that moment, his hunched back bent even more, and he looked even older. Li Jinyan, who quickly stood up to soothe the old man, said in a low voice, "It's because of the nature of my uncle's work. He can't come back even if he wants to. Don't worry. He will come back to see you as soon as he finishes his work." Li Jinyan's uncle, Fu Yusheng, had taken over his father's business and was now engaged in missile research in a remote area of the country. It was common for him to not return for 3 to 5 years. The old man, whose health was deteriorating day by day, often thought of his only living son. Sometimes, he would stare at Fu Yusheng's photo for an entire day. When he heard this, Li Jinyan, who was trembling with fear, pursed his lips into a sharp line. Due to the nature of his uncle's work, he couldn't be filial to his grandfather, but as a junior, he had to share his elder's burdens and solve his problems. Yi Qian, he still had to find her. Jinyan, if grandfather doesn't wait for your uncle to come back, you have to remember to continue looking for your aunt on behalf of your uncle and the Fu family. You have to find her. Even if she's no longer alive, you have to find her family, understand? Chapter 22:19. This was your grandmother's last wish. In the future, it will also become your grandfather's last wish. It is also your uncle's greatest wish in his life. The old man was a little tired. He closed the yellowed album and sealed away his memories. He then said to Li Jinyan, "I'll keep this album. You should stop looking at it. These were all bad memories. Why would he make things difficult for his only descendant? You should rest for a while. Leave the search for Aunt to me." Li Jinyan took out a blanket from the cabinet and laid it directly on top of the tatami mat. He placed the buckwheat pillow in place and carefully helped the old man lie down to rest. "You should sleep. I'll come back to see you later." He was going to look for Yi Qian right now and tell Xia Jinyuan about this matter. For the sake of the wishes of 3 generations of the Fu family, he had to go back to the hospital to look for Yi Qian. No matter how much she resisted, he still had to look for her. In the hospital, Yi Qian looked down slightly and said, "I didn't admit it, and I don't want to admit it. To me, it doesn't matter if I know my biological father or not. I only know that my father passed away a long time ago. There can't be another father in this world. Captain Xia, the next time Captain Li looks for you, just reject him on my behalf. Tell him that he got the wrong person. The woman in the photo is not my mother." His tone was very calm, without a trace of emotion. This was not good. It meant that Yi Qian had been suppressing his emotions. To Xia Jinyuan, Yi Qian might be Li Jinyan's cousin. The sudden news really shocked him. "No, don't talk about it. Let's just talk about old Master Fu." This old man was not an ordinary person. Even old Master Fu had to salute him when he saw him. This old man was one of the founders of our country's missiles, atomic bombs, and space satellites. He was one of the main indicators of a country's strategic nuclear power and the development of military science and technology, strategic missiles. Yi Qian probably didn't know about all this. If Yi Qian was really old Master Fu's granddaughter, Xia Jinyuan couldn't help but sit up straight. His handsome face instantly became serious. "Yi Qian, do you know who Li Jinyan's grandfather is?" Even if it was Xia Jinyuan who asked this question, Yi Qian still resisted it from the bottom of her heart. However, because of his serious expression, when he mentioned who Li Jinyan's grandfather was even more respectful. Yi Qian shook her head. "He didn't mention it, I'm not sure. Fu Yiwei is old Master Fu. He is Li Jinyan's maternal grandfather. He is a legendary old man." Xia Jinyuan looked into her eyes and said slowly, "You are familiar with him, right?" "How could I be unfamiliar with him?" Yi Qian was shocked. She immediately said, "Li Jinyan must have mistaken me for someone else. I should have taken a closer look at the young woman in the photo. I'm starting to suspect that my eyes were playing tricks on me. That's right, I must have mistaken her for someone else. The woman in the photo just looks like my mother. Needless to say, Li Jinyan must have mistaken her for someone else, and she must have seen wrongly as well." Xia Jinyuan saw how anxious she was to clear her name and couldn't help but laugh. "I'm also a little suspicious. We have to clarify this matter first. I'll call him and ask him to come over again. I'll call him." Yi Qian regretted being so impulsive earlier. Li Jinyan, who was rushing to the hospital, received a call from Yi Qian. After she finished speaking, he said calmly, "I'll be there in half an hour. Wait for me for a while." Mistaken her for someone else? How could that be? Chapter 22:20. After this call, Li Jinyan was even more confident that he could convince Yi Qian to visit his grandfather. If he had known that bringing up his grandfather's identity would be so effective, he would have brought it up right from the start so that Yi Qian wouldn't be offended. Yi Qian put down his phone and said to Xia Jinyuan with some lingering fear, "Luckily, I didn't say anything overboard. I only said that he got the wrong person. Luckily, I don't have the habit of scolding people. If I had said anything that insulted old Master Fu, I wouldn't have dared to ask for his forgiveness even if I had to beg for forgiveness. It was too scary, too scary." She really didn't expect Li Jinyan to be old Master Fu's grandson. She also didn't expect that old Master Fu would be one of the stories he told her from a long time ago. Luckily, she suppressed her anger at the time and didn't say anything overboard. Luckily, Yi Qian patted his chest gently. He was so nervous that he had to gulp down a large glass of cold water to suppress the lingering fear in his heart. Old Master Fu was a hero who devoted himself to national defense and led the country's missile and satellite research. He was the hero who made sure that the country was no longer threatened by other countries. She definitely couldn't be his granddaughter. It was too scary, too scary. Her heart almost jumped out of her throat. Seeing how nervous she was, Xia Jinyuan smiled and didn't say anything. Got the wrong person. Did he see wrongly? That was unlikely. Little Fox wasn't an ordinary person. She was a Special Forces soldier who had undergone special training. She was a Special Forces soldier who could accurately find a target in thousands of photos. How could she get the wrong person? When he said that he was suspicious, it was mainly because he was too shocked. Because he had done a detailed investigation, he subconsciously thought that he might have gotten the wrong person. After calming down and thinking about it, the possibility of getting the wrong person was not high. Old Master Fu was a genius. His IQ was much higher than everyone else's. His classmates had the illusion that they were actually mentally retarded. It was the same for Yi Qian. It might be a hereditary IQ. Xia Jinyuan thought to himself, but he did not tell Yi Qian. He was already so nervous. If he said it out loud, he was afraid that he would be so nervous that he would not want to meet Li Jinyan. 30 minutes later, Li Jinyan pushed open the door and walked calmly to Yi Qian's side. Before he could say anything, Yi Qian said, "Demon King, show me the photo again. I must have mistaken you for someone else. You can look at the photos later. Let me tell you a story first." Li Jinyan moved a small stool to the side of the bed and sat down. His cold and calm eyes stared at Yi Qian as he told an old story. This was a story about old Master Fu when he was young. He talked about the things that happened during those years, his children who died young, his daughter, Fu Yuhen, and his son, Fu Yuxing. These things and these people made Yi Qian's heart ache as he listened quietly. It turned out that old Master Fu's life was so rough. My uncle went to the army with a mission and met a female soldier named Hong Mei. Uncle fell in love with her and soon fell in love with her. When it was time to get married, Uncle was suddenly recalled and grounded for a year. This story made Yi Qian's pupil's contract. Suddenly recalled and locked up for a year. In her mother's diary, it was mentioned that the man she loved had suddenly disappeared without leaving a word behind. Could it be that he was right? Mother really? For a moment, Yi Qian's heart was in a mess. His brain could not think straight. Chapter 22-21. Li Jinyan, who had returned to the hospital, was determined to bring Yi Qian to old Master Fu. Thus, he stared intently at Yi Qian the entire time, not missing the slightest change in her expression. Seeing that Yi Qian's expression had changed drastically because of what he said, he felt that he might have found a breakthrough. His voice, as cold as the snow on Mount Tianshan, slowly recounted the past that had been sealed away for a long time, but had always been remembered by everyone in the Fu family. No one in the family knew about my uncle's sudden recall, including my maternal grandparents. A year later, my maternal grandfather, who was researching a certain technology, had a week's leave. My maternal grandfather, who had not been home for 3 years, decided to go home to take a look. However, before he could leave the research base, he was invited to another place. Yi Qian's hands, which were resting on her knees, clenched tightly. Her mother had clearly written in her diary, "I waited outside happily. I waited until the sun rose. I waited until the sun was high in the sky. I waited until the sunset covered the sky and the sun's last ray of light disappeared. I still waited." When she saw this sentence, she did not understand the deeper meaning behind it. With the devil's words, could she think of it this way? Her mother waited from sunrise to sunset. Was she waiting for the man she loved to register their marriage with her? Could she understand it this way? Don't worry. Calm down and listen to what the devil has to say. Now was not the time for her to speak. It was not the time for everything to be clear. Her tightly clenched hands had just loosened when they were held by a slender and strong hand. She reflexively held this hand tightly, as if she had found someone to rely on. Even her heartbeat became much calmer. A very touching love story. Listen well, Yi Qian. Xia Jinyuan held her hand tightly. His deep eyes contained a faint smile that could calm Yi Qian even more. He reminded her gently, "Don't get distracted. Listen to the whole story first." Li Jinyan subtly glanced at her interlocked fingers with Xia Jinyuan's right hand. His thin lips, which had been pressed tightly, suddenly broke into a faint smile. He was no longer nervous, no longer worried that Yi Qian would suddenly refuse to listen to him, because he knew that his past had successfully attracted Yi Qian, making her calm down and listen to him slowly. Even now, grandfather still remembers that it took him 5 days and 5 nights to arrive at a deserted place with only yellow sand. Here, he saw his uncle, whom he hadn't seen for almost 4 years. Only then did he learn that his uncle had been confined here for more than a year. Someone reported to the army that my uncle had leaked the secret and that he had secret connections with foreign countries. Uncle and grandfather are both engaged in missile research. Someone reported him for leaking secrets. Regardless of whether it's true or not, it's very serious. To be on the safe side, we immediately took away all the research materials in Uncle's hands and secretly took them away. When he arrived at his destination, grandfather saw my uncle, whom he hadn't seen for 4 years and whom he couldn't even write a letter to. It was also at this time that he found out that my uncle had been confined for a year. He also found out that my uncle had a girlfriend in the army that he was preparing to get married. Unfortunately, 3 days before my uncle and my aunt registered their marriage, my uncle was suddenly recalled from confinement and lost contact with his fiancée. Yi Qian, whose eyes were dark, looked up and stared unblinkingly at Li Jinyan as if to confirm something. She didn't speak immediately. Li Jinyan, who was interrupted by her gaze, suddenly felt his heart tighten. He didn't show it on his face as he calmly waited for Yi Qian to speak. Chapter 22-22. After a while, Yi Qian asked suspiciously, "Why haven't we written to each other in the past 4 years?" "That's because our country's missile and satellite research was carried out in secret on a zero foundation basis. In order to keep it a secret, all the scientists involved in the research were not allowed to leave the research base easily. They were also not allowed to contact their families casually and lived in isolation from the rest of the world." Xia Jinyuan answered Yi Qian in a deep voice and full of respect, "It's normal that you haven't written to your family in the past 4 years." Yi Qian was filled with deep veneration when he heard this. Li Jinyan knew that Xia Jinyuan was speaking up for him, so he nodded slightly to express his gratitude. Grandfather and grandmother are both engaged in research and development and rarely come home. They don't know what's going on with my mother and uncle, so it's normal for them not to receive any letters from their children for a year. This is also why grandfather doesn't know that uncle has been in confinement for as long as a year, and he doesn't know that uncle is preparing to get married. After uncle secretly told them about this, grandfather immediately asked a friend to investigate in secret, but he didn't find anything. There's no female soldier named Hong Mei in the army. Yi Qian's fingertips were trembling. Could it be that Mom didn't tell anyone her real name? That's why he didn't find out where she was. He went back to the army to look for Mom after a year, but Mom wasn't even in the army at that time. She went home to give birth to her. That's why he didn't find out where she was. Yi Qian's heart was in turmoil as he guessed and thought, a year ago, uncle and aunt were preparing to get married. A year later, grandfather went to investigate again, but there was no news at all. For a long time, grandfather wondered if uncle had gone insane after being confined for a year. The so-called fiancé was just a figment of uncle's imagination and didn't exist. If it wasn't for this photo. Li Jinyan took out the old photo again and looked down at the young man and woman in the photo. There was a slight ripple in his cold voice. It was because of this photo that grandfather confirmed that uncle did have a fiancé who was about to get a marriage certificate. Li Jinyan handed the photo back to Yi Jian. His expression was cold, and his dark, unfathomable eyes revealed a faint light. It was a light filled with hope. Yi Jian, I'm willing to invite you to take a good, serious look at this photo again, okay? There were too many emotions in his eyes that made Yi Qian's heart heavy. She didn't even have the courage to reach out her hand. What if he had mistaken her for someone else? She didn't reach out to take it, so Li Jinyan kept holding it in his hand, patiently waiting for her to reach out. Take it and take a good look at it. Xia Jinyuan tightened his grip on her hand and moved closer to her. He said gently and calmly, for your own sake and for Mr. Lu's sake, you should take it and take a good look at it. The familiar aura that made her feel at ease wrapped around her, giving her the courage to reach out her hand. The moment she took the photo, Yi Qian saw Li Jinyan's tense shoulders visibly relax. He was actually afraid that she would reject him again. Yi Qian took a deep breath and looked down. She wasn't mistaken. The young woman in the photo was indeed her mother. There was a photo in the diary of her mother wearing a military uniform with the same smile. Even the size was the same. The only difference was that it was a photo of her mother alone. Chapter 22-23. Yi Qian stared at him for a long time, so long that Li Jinyan couldn't help but hold his breath. His expression was tense as he stared at Yi Qian. It felt like a century had passed before Yi Qian finally spoke in a low voice. Hong Mei is not my mother's name. It's just her code name. My mother was part of the first batch of female special forces soldiers in our country with a code name. Hong Mei is not her name. Sir, you returned to the military a year later to find out about my mother's whereabouts. At that time, my mother had just given birth to me. She was at home and didn't return to the military. Li Jinyan was very close to his maternal grandfather's family. His relationship with his uncle was more like that of a father and son. When he heard Yi Qian's words, even someone as calm as him became excited. No wonder grandfather didn't find out about my aunt's whereabouts. It turns out that Hong Mei isn't my aunt's real name. Li Jinyan's voice trembled because of his excitement. His gaze fell on the photo and he suddenly looked up at Yi Qian. So, Yi Qian, you admit that my aunt is your mother and my uncle is your father. You admit it, right? Yi Qian didn't look up. She kept staring at the young man and woman in the photo as if she wanted to carve their faces into her heart. I don't know if your uncle is my father. I only know that the young woman in the photo is my mother. In her previous life, she didn't know that her father was someone else. In this life, not only did she know, but she also saw his photo. She wasn't surprised, only panicked. She didn't know how to face the panic. As long as she admitted that her aunt was her mother, everything would be fine. Li Jinyan, whose gaze never left her, said in a hoarse voice, "If you want to know if my uncle is your father, Yi Qian, it's not difficult. As long as you want to know, we'll know immediately. Did your uncle look for my mother after that? Did he look for her himself? Or did he ask someone else to do it?" Yi Qian did not answer him. Instead, he seemed to want to verify something. His voice suddenly became very cold. "Demon King, please answer me seriously." She couldn't immediately accept Fu Yuxing as her father, nor could she say it out loud. She could only use uncle as a temporary replacement. As long as uncle has time, he will personally look for aunt. He personally told me that as long as he is still alive, he will definitely not give up looking for her. To this day, her uncle was still unmarried. The column in his file said married. Not only did my uncle never give up, but my grandmother also told my mother before she died that she must help my uncle find my aunt. Before my mother passed away, she told me that I must help my uncle find my aunt. I just came from my grandfather's house, and when I came to the hospital, my grandfather told me that he hoped that I could continue to help my uncle find my aunt and help the Fu family find my aunt. Even if she is no longer alive, I have to find her family. Yi Qian, counting from my maternal grandmother's generation, 3 generations of the Fu family have been searching for my aunt. As long as there is no news, they will not give up. Yi Qian was already in tears. "Mother, did you hear that? Did you hear that? The person you love deeply did not abandon you. He did not mean to let you wait from sunrise to sunset. He really wanted to go with you to get the marriage certificate, but he could not. Mother, did you hear that? Did you hear that? The person you love deeply did not abandon you. He has always been looking for you. He has never given up looking for you. Not only that, his family has always been looking for you. They have never given up. They have never given up." Chapter 22-24. Yi Qian sobbed softly with tears streaming down her face. As her tears flowed out, the stone in her heart finally shattered. Even though her mother did not manage to wait for her lover to marry her, in the eyes of the man she loved deeply, her mother was his wife. Even if they did not have a marriage certificate, her mother was his wife. At this moment, Yi Qian's tears flowed like a broken dam. She was so happy that she could no longer control her emotions. In front of the 2 men, she could not stop crying. Xia Jinyuan's eyes darkened. He did not try to persuade her to stop crying. Instead, he raised his hand and gently stroked her back. "Cry, cry. Let your tears wash away all the sadness in your heart." He blamed himself for not realizing that his little fox cared so much about these things. In her heart, her biological father was a heartless man who abandoned his wife and daughter. Even though she did not mention it, there was always a knot in her heart. That was right. She had been tortured as a child. Ying had a father and a mother who loved her dearly, while she had no parents and was bullied by Ying. When she needed the protection and care of her parents the most, she did not receive any care. She had to rely on herself to get through it. When she was beaten, wronged, or scolded, she could only curl up in a corner and lick the scars in her heart. No one would stand up for her. No one would feel sorry for her. She could only rely on herself and no one else. At that time, even though she did not know that her biological father was someone else, once she found out, how could she not hate him? He even boasted that he knew her best, but in the end, With deep self-blame in his eyes, Xia Jinyuan tightly hugged his lover, who made his entire body ache. He tilted his head slightly and kept kissing her hair. I'm sorry, my little fox. It was my oversight. I did not realize that you cared so much about this matter. If I had known earlier, I would not have let you suffer so much. I would not have let Li Jinyan bring up this matter first and make you cry. Xia Jinyuan pursed his lips. In front of Li Jinyan, he pulled Yi Qian, who was crying like an injured animal, into his arms. He stroked the back of her head with one hand and let her tears flow into his clothes. This time, Yi Qian was crying really hard. She buried herself in Xia Jinyuan's arms and gripped his shirt tightly with both hands. She cried so hard that her body twitched. Other than the sound of her crying, there was no other sound in the ward. The two men did not dare to speak easily. They quietly accompanied her and let her cry. Xia Jinyuan hugged Yi Qian and let her cry in his arms. Meanwhile, Li Jinyan clenched his fists and tried his best to suppress the urge to hug his only sister. This was his little sister, the only sister that he could truly feel a blood connection with. Her cries told him that her life was not going as well as it should have been. No, it was not that her life was not going well, but it was filled with suffering. Li Jinyan clenched his fists even tighter. His cold and handsome face was as dark as water, and there were wisps of haze between his eyebrows. The air pressure around him was low, as if he was wrapped in dark clouds, making him look gloomy. He needed to investigate his sister's past life. He had to do it properly. He had to find out everything. In the past, her life was filled with suffering. In the future, he had to make sure that her life was filled with love. He did not ask to make up for her past suffering. He only hoped that her life would be bright and sunny in the future. Chapter 22-25. Hearing that her voice was hoarse from crying, Li Jinyan pursed his lips and stood up. He silently poured a cup of warm water, his thin lips moving slightly as he said to Xia Jinyuan, "The weather is dry, let her drink a cup of water first." Li Jinyan's idea was to drink a cup of water before crying. Xia Jinyuan nodded slightly and took the cup of water from him. He lowered his head and whispered softly into Yi Qian's ear, "Little fox, let's drink a cup of water first. Our voices are hoarse from crying." With one arm around Yi Qian's shoulder and the other holding the cup of water, Li Jinyan's gaze darkened. His cold gaze swept over the man who was hugging his sister. Li Jinyan pursed his lips even tighter. If he dared to bully his sister in the future, he would have to bear the consequences. Also, hugging and kissing before they were even married. He had to remind his sister to not let Xia Jinyuan take advantage of her. Li Jinyan, who had yet to receive Yi Qian's acknowledgement, was now calling himself her brother. Xia Jinyuan, who was lowering his head to persuade Yi Qian to drink water, suddenly felt a razor-sharp gaze sweep over him. He looked up and saw Li Jinyan, who was sitting by the hospital bed, staring at him unblinkingly. His gaze was somewhat unfriendly as it swept over his hands that were hugging little fox from time to time. His gaze was so sharp that it was as if he wanted to cut off his hands. If little fox became old Master Fu's granddaughter, then wouldn't Demon King Li become little fox's brother? Wouldn't he become Demon King Li's brother-in-law? Xia Jinyuan suddenly felt that something was not right. Demon King Li's gaze was so unfriendly that it was as if he had kidnapped his sister. Once Yi Qian called him a brother, his life would not be easy. That would not be good. Before they even started, Li Jinyan was already dissatisfied with Xia Jinyuan's hugging of Yi Qian. However, Li Jinyan didn't say it out loud. He knew very well that he didn't have the right, nor did he have the right to disagree. From Yi Qian's expression, he could tell that she trusted Xia Jinyuan a lot. She was willing to tell Xia Jinyuan everything that was on her mind. As a brother who had yet to be acknowledged, his position in Yi Qian's heart was far inferior to Xia Jinyuan's. Li Jinyan was well aware of his own limitations, so he only glanced at her once before looking away. Fortunately, Yi Qian did not continue crying. She had been crying for about 10 minutes, and after venting all the negative emotions in her heart, she gradually stopped crying. Hearing Xia Jinyuan advising her to drink a glass of water, she took a deep breath to calm herself down and waited until her breathing calmed down before she lifted her head from his arms. Sorry, I cried a little too much. Yi Qian took the glass of water. Her eyes were as red as a little rabbit's. She looked apologetic. When I thought of some things, I couldn't hold back my tears. I just wanted to cry to my heart's content. This was probably the first time in her life that she had cried so miserably. Even when she was beaten by Captain Xia and had to be hospitalized, she did not shed a single tear. She knew that her biological father did not abandon his wife and daughter on purpose. She did not know why, but she could not suppress the grievance in her heart. She just wanted to cry. You never need to apologize in front of me. Li Jinyan pulled out a tissue and handed it to Yi Qian. His usually cold voice was unbelievably gentle. Wipe your tears. Your eyes are like a rabbit's. Her eyes and nose were red from crying. She really looked like a little white rabbit. Li Jinyan couldn't help but curve his lips slightly. Chapter 22-26. At that moment, Xia Jinyuan felt a sense of crisis. What Li Jinyan was doing now was exactly what he should be doing as a boyfriend. It wasn't just any kind of trouble, it was quite troublesome. The devil, whose face was so cold that even male soldiers were afraid of him, could very well be a guy who spoiled his sister to the point of having no principles. It was really hard to get used to such a devil. Yi Qian, who took the tissue to wipe her tears, didn't know that Xia Jinyuan's heart was in turmoil. She said, "Thank you," a little embarrassedly and avoided Li Jinyan's caring gaze. Xia Jinyuan wasn't the only one who wasn't used to it. Yi Qian wasn't used to it either. The devil, Li Jinyan, had a strong reputation. In training and in daily life, he was always expressionless, and his eyes were as cold as the snow that never melted. Even if he just glanced around, it would give people the illusion that their hearts were being pierced by thousands of arrows. She had experienced this illusion before. But now, he was handing her water and tissue, and even said something emotional. Yi Qian hid her discomfort by drinking water. Li Jinyan wasn't anxious when he knew that she was avoiding him. He knew that before today, he was just Yi Qian's comrade and there was nothing special about him. But now that his status had suddenly changed, he could understand that she couldn't accept it for the time being and chose to avoid him. There was still a long way to go. He would let her know that he was a very qualified brother, so he wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't in a hurry, but his grandfather was a little anxious. Seeing that her emotions had stabilized and there was no longer any sadness on her face, Li Jinyan asked carefully, "Can you come with me to visit my grandfather today? The old man's condition is getting worse by the day. The housekeeper told me that my grandfather hasn't slept for the past few nights and has been sitting alone until dawn. I'm very worried. Can you come with me to visit the old man?" Yi Qian, who wasn't mentally prepared, wanted to reject him, but she swallowed her words. Xia Jinyuan gently squeezed her hand to stop her from blurting out the words that were about to escape her mouth. "Let's go and visit the old man. Not for anything else, but for all that he has done for the country. Yi Qian, as a soldier, you should also visit him. His little fox had suffered too much and suffered too much. Now that she had found her family, he still hoped that she could return to the Fu family, a home where her family was waiting for her, even if she was about to have a brother who might take away his job as a boyfriend. Xia Jinyuan looked at her with a smile, giving her the courage to take the next step forward. I'll accompany you. Let's go visit the old man together. Yi Jian was silent. She knew that she was timid. She had never thought that she would still have relatives in this world. Suddenly, she had a father, grandfather, and brother. She was not prepared to face them at all. What if it's not true? What if there was a mistake? With me by your side, little fox, will you still be afraid? Xia Jinyuan didn't give her a chance to back away. He placed his hands on her shoulders and made her face him. His deep eyes looked at her gently and firmly, encouraging her. No matter what happens, you will always have me by your side. After remaining silent for a long time, Yi Qian looked at Xia Jinyuan, who was encouraging her to take the next step. She then looked at Demon Kingly, who was holding his breath and waiting for her answer. After a long while, her cold voice sounded in the quiet ward. Okay. Chapter 22-27. The word okay made Li Jinyan's eyes sting. Almost losing his composure, he secretly adjusted his breathing and said, okay, after he finishes his drip, we'll go home together. He said, go home, which showed how much he was looking forward to it. It was also at this moment that Yi Qian's heart trembled slightly. Loved ones. Did she really have any loved ones other than Uncle Chen and Grandpa Jen? Did she really have any? What if it was a mistake? What if it wasn't true? What if it was just an empty joy? Sitting in the car, Yi Qian was uneasy because of all kinds of uncertainty. He didn't feel happy at all. When you see old master later, just greet him respectfully. Since Li Jinyan didn't say anything else, you don't have to worry too much about it. Acknowledging your ancestors is a big deal, so he won't do it casually. He has to make all the necessary arrangements. Xia Jinyuan held her hand. It was a little cold and a little nervous. He smiled and said in a low voice, don't think about anything else. Just think that you're going to visit a great scientist. He was telling Yi Qian not to treat old Master Fu as his grandfather, but to visit a great scientist with a respectful heart. With him by her side, Yi Qian did indeed calm down a lot. Li Jinyan was very grateful for Xia Jinyuan's help. If it weren't for his help today, Yi Qian wouldn't have agreed to go home with him so easily. His sister should have trusted her family the most, but now she trusted Xia Jinyuan so much. Li Jinyan was happy and bitter at the same time. He was happy that his sister had a man who understood her, loved her, and cared for her. He also felt bitter because he didn't accompany her through all the difficulties and didn't even know how many difficulties she went through. Li Jinyan glanced at the rearview mirror from the corner of his eye and saw that Yi Jian's attention was all on Xia Jinyuan. She didn't seem happy about going home. Li Jinyan couldn't bear to look away. To her, was family kinship something that did not exist? Had she never thought of receiving the care of her loved ones? Was it because he was so disappointed in his family that he no longer desired it? Then, what kind of environment did she live in? Just how much had she suffered for her to be so indifferent and insecure? Li Jinyan thought back to the first time he met Yi Qian and saw the maturity between her brows that was beyond her age. His heart suddenly ached. His sister should have grown up like a princess and been pampered by her family. But because of fate, the Fu family did not even know of her existence. Li Jinyan, whose emotions had been fluctuating, finally calmed down when the car drove into the depths of a park that hid the hustle and bustle of the city. Back then, when the capital was planned, the original appearance of the entire mountain was deliberately preserved. On the left is the suburban park, and on this side is the place where the old scientists retire. It is guarded by armed police, and ordinary people are not allowed to enter or leave at will. In order to let Yi Qian relax, Xia Jinyuan picked a topic to introduce the place. The scientists who developed the first generation of computers also live here. The small houses hidden behind the trees are all old scientists who are national treasures. If you meet any old man here, his identity will definitely shock you. The car followed the winding mountain road. Through the car window, Yi Qian saw several small red brick houses. When she thought about how the people living in these houses were all scientists who had dedicated their lives to the country, the nervousness in her heart disappeared and was replaced by respect. Chapter 22-28. After turning a corner, Yi Qian saw two old men holding hands in front of him. Their backs were hunched, but they looked quite elegant as they walked slowly. Beside the two old men's feet was a pair of puppies wagging their tails happily. They chased after the two old men's footsteps, ran in front of them happily, and whimpered back to the two old men's feet. They shook their heads and wagged their tails to make the two old men happy. Xia Jinyuan did not know the two old men. Li Jinyan introduced them. This is Mr. Tang and his wife, Professor Su. Mr. Tang was the first generation of core computer scientists in our country, and Professor Su was the senior engineer who completed the magnetic core memory. The two old men devoted themselves to computer research and development in our country and did not leave behind any children. Not only Mr. Tang and Professor Su, but almost all the scientists and senior engineers who lived here did not leave behind any children. They dedicated their lives to the development of our country's science. Yi Qian, who had never heard of this before, had forgotten where he was going. He was so shocked that he did not know what to say. The car passed by the two elders. Yi Qian turned her head and looked at the two stooped but tall figures with respect in her eyes. Xia Jinyuan, who had retracted his gaze, talked about the past in a deep voice. This was a story about how poor people had no dignity, and poor countries had no status. At that time, our country did not have the ability to manufacture our own weapons. Even the weapons used by the army were all produced overseas. Under such circumstances, the older generation of scientists worked hard to realize our dream of becoming a powerful country with a strong army. When we went out for an interview, our scientists always listened the most seriously and were the most humble. In the late 1950s, a big country that was originally helping our country suddenly left, leaving behind a pile of burning blueprints. In order to save the blueprints from the fire, our old scientists did not dare to use water to put out the fire. Instead, they reached their hands into the fire and snatched the blueprints back. Then, they pieced the blueprints back together bit by bit. They knelt on the ground and carefully pieced them back together. This time, they knelt not for the blueprints, but for their dignity. From being passive to being independent, from being dependent to being confident, the reason why a big country could rise was because there were many scientists like Mr. Fu. They contributed silently to the rise of a big country. They even sacrificed their lives for the rise of a big country. They were willing to give up everything for the rise of a big country. Yi Qian, if we compare our current lives with the suffering that the old scientists once suffered, do you still think that you can't overcome the hurdle, that you can't take the courage to take the next step? Yi Qian heard the tears in her eyes and shook her head. There was nothing else. Compared to what the old scientist had gone through, what else could she not overcome? Demon King, it's true that I'm not sure if your uncle is my father, so I won't be able to call old Mr. Grandpa later, but I'll cooperate with you to see if I'm really old Mr.'s granddaughter. The car had just entered a flat paved road that extended from the main road when Yi Qian's sudden words caught Li Jinyan off guard and he slammed on the brakes. They didn't expect him to slam on the brakes, and the two people sitting in the back fell forward. If it weren't for the two people's agility, their faces would have hit the back of the driver's seat. Demon King, drive properly. Xia Jinyuan held Yi Qian's hand tightly and sat properly. She teased, I'm injured. You can't deliberately play tricks on me just because I'm Yi Qian's boyfriend. Chapter 22-29. Yi Qian was very nervous. How's your wound? Let me take a look. His words made her tense up. Xia Jinyuan hurriedly said, It's fine, it's fine. Don't be nervous. I was just scaring him. He didn't manage to scare the devil, but his little fox got scared. Yi Qian heaved a sigh of relief. As long as he's fine, Li Jinyan wasn't scared. If he was that weak, he wouldn't be Q King. He didn't immediately start the car. Instead, he turned his head and looked at Yi Qian with dark eyes. You'll really cooperate? Yes, we'll cooperate. Yi Qian nodded solemnly. Ever since she found out that she had no choice in what happened back then and that she didn't abandon her wife and daughter on purpose, Yi Qian knew that she had already accepted the person she had never met in her 2 lifetimes, her father. However, the word father was too unfamiliar to her. Ever since she lost her parents, she had never called out father or mother again. She was so unfamiliar with the word father that she didn't know how to pronounce it. This was another piece of good news since Yi Qian agreed to go home. Li Jinyan's cold face broke into a deep smile. His features were extremely handsome, as if they were carefully carved. Usually, his cold expression would make people fearful of him, but now that he suddenly smiled, he was so handsome that people couldn't take their eyes off him. However, his smile was short-lived. It wasn't breathtaking yet, and his expression was ice-cold again. Grandfather often told him that life didn't bring disaster to people, but that they should learn to cherish and let go. They should learn to cherish the present and let go of the past. His sister suddenly said that she would cooperate with him. Did he think that she had already let go of her prejudice against uncle? That she had let go of her past? Li Jinyan was overjoyed. He looked at Xia Jinyuan, who had been speaking up for the Fu family, and thanked him sincerely. Today, he had been encouraging Yi Qian from the very beginning. That was why she had been able to accept the Fu family so quickly. In his eyes, he could see the deep love and encouragement he had for Yi Qian. Xia Jinyuan was not only his sister's lover, but he was also her guide in life. He used his own way to guide his sister so that she could go further and broaden her mind. He admired Xia Jinyuan's character and felt reassured. Xia Jinyuan smiled and said, You don't have to thank me. I only care about Yi Qian, not anyone else. He didn't want to see his little fox being troubled by things. He didn't want to see her worrying because of it. He didn't want to see his little fox unhappy at all, so he would do his best to help her. When faced with a predicament, avoiding it would only make things worse. Only by facing it head-on and facing it bravely was the true way to solve the problem. After driving for a while, the car saw a small bungalow surrounded by maple trees. The bungalow did not have a metal gate, so the car drove straight into the bungalow and parked in the designated parking space. Li Jinyan got out of the car with light footsteps. He walked up the steps and rang the doorbell. Yi Qian, who was standing at the bottom of the steps, hurriedly straightened her clothes and asked Xia Jinyuan to check if her military cap was on properly. Before she could straighten her uniform, the tightly shut door opened. A white-haired old man with a kind aura stood at the door. The moment Yi Qian saw the old man, she didn't know why, but she suddenly felt her heart skip a beat. When the old man's eyes met hers, she couldn't help but hold her breath. Grandfather, I brought 2 friends to visit you. Li Jinyan held the old man's arm and turned his body slightly so that the old man could see his friends better. Chapter 22-30. As Li Jinyan turned sideways, Yi Qian could see Mr. Fu more clearly. Similarly, Mr. Fu could see the girl standing in the sunlight with a faint smile on her face. She was as quiet as a painting. It was as if they had passed through centuries and reincarnations before they finally looked into each other's eyes. Even the wind couldn't bear to disturb them. It made everything stop, leaving only silence. Mr. Fu, who was supported by his grandson, looked at Yi Qian and asked Li Jinyan, "Where did you find such a beautiful girl? This is the first time you've brought a girl home to see me." Mr. Fu's hands trembled as he held onto his walking stick. He said, "This is the first time you've brought a girl home. Why do I feel like this girl looks familiar? Jinyan, have I seen this little girl somewhere before?" With that sentence, Yi Qian, who had finally calmed down and met Mr. Fu's kind eyes, felt her heart skip a beat. Her heart rate instantly soared. It was as if a seed had suddenly fallen into her chest. It took root and sprouted. In an instant, it grew crazily, making her chest feel as if it was about to explode. That feeling was like a fallen leaf returning to its roots, or a wild goose returning to its nest, or a small boat returning to port. "I have to go out and take a look. It's too far away. I can't see clearly." Mr. Fu was old, and his eyesight was not as good as it used to be. 2 years ago, he had cataract surgery on his left eye, so he still had double vision when he saw people. He seemed to want to verify something. He impatiently grabbed Li Jinyan's arm and said in a slightly hurried tone, "Quick, get Xiao Lu to bring my glasses over. The sun is shining brightly outside. I have to take a good look. This girl. I've definitely seen her before. I've definitely seen her before." Before the glasses were brought over, Mr. Fu, who couldn't wait, stepped out of the door with his walking stick. Yi Jian's heart seemed to jump out of her throat in the next second. She didn't think much at all. When she saw the old man take a shaky step forward, there was an invisible force that suddenly pushed her forward. She, who didn't dare to move forward, suddenly rushed forward a few steps. Then she suddenly stopped and stood at the bottom of the stairs, motionlessly looking at the old man who was walking out. Li Jinyan was afraid that he would fall, so he supported him and said, "Slow down. Uncle Lu has brought your glasses. You should put them on first." The housekeeper who took care of the old man's daily life quickly took care of the old man. Li Jinyan did not ask him to wait on the old man. Instead, he asked him to return to the house first. He and Yi Qian would be enough. The old man, who had been observing Yi Qian's every move, put on his glasses. When he looked up, he could clearly see why the girl standing under the sun looked so familiar. This child. How could he not look familiar? How could he not be familiar with a child who looked like his daughter-in-law? Her facial features were similar to his daughter-in-law's, but her forehead was the same as Yuxing's. She looked like both his daughter-in-law and his son. How could he not be familiar with this child? Step by step, the old man walked closer and stopped at the top of the stairs. He waved at Yi Qian, who was only a few steps away, and said kindly, "Come, child. Let Grandpa take a good look at you." The old man, who had experienced many hardships, could tell something was amiss. As he spoke kindly, tears glistened in his eyes. There was no need to say too much or make any big movements. His weather-beaten eyes were filled with tears that had long since returned to their calm state. Chapter 22:31. The old man was tall and handsome when he was young. He was over 1.8 meters tall and attracted attention wherever he went in the south. Even after he studied in the west, his tall and handsome physique and scholarly temperament did not diminish his attractiveness. Now that he was old, his figure was no longer tall, but the old man's temperament had accumulated decades of ups and downs. Even though his face was wrinkled and had dark brown age spots, his calm temperament was far superior to the two young men beside him. Standing on the steps, he was like an ancient pine tree that had experienced the vicissitudes of life but still stood tall and proud, respected by the world. With tears in her eyes, Yi Qian suppressed the palpitations in her heart and did not take a step closer to the old man. When she was in the car, she suspected that she might not be the old man's granddaughter. Then, when she saw the old man, a sense of familiarity that originated from her blood rushed into her heart and made her believe that Li Jinyan's uncle was her father, and the old scientist in front of her who had dedicated his life to the country was her grandfather. It was too difficult to take this step. It was as if her feet were rooted to the ground. She wanted to go over, but she was hesitant. The old man's legs are not very convenient. Little Fox, quickly go and help the old man back to his room. Xia Jinyuan walked to her side and reminded her in a low voice, "It's cold outside. Don't let the old man catch a cold." Yi Qian turned her head in a daze and whispered as if she was in a dream, "Captain Xia, I think I have a grandfather. I think I have a grandfather, I think I have a family." The moment Xia Jinyuan saw the old man, he was very sure that Yi Qian was indeed the old man's granddaughter. The two generations had a common temperament, a sense of righteousness that did not admit defeat and did not bow down. Her eyebrows were as beautiful as a painting and her eyes were clear. At this moment, she looked like a lost child who could not find her home. It made Xia Jinyuan's heart ache. His little fox, his lover, had always longed for a family. Therefore, she treated Uncle Chen and Uncle Zhen as her loved ones. With them, she would have a home that belonged to her. Now, with old Master Fu, Little Fox would have another home from now on. Holding her hand, Xia Jinyuan said in a low and steady voice, "Follow your feelings. Don't be afraid. Don't be confused. Believe in your feelings." The old man did not rush him. From the moment he saw Yi Qian, his gaze had never left Yi Qian. He stood at the top of the stairs 9 steps away from Yi Qian. His gaze was kind and gentle as he quietly waited for Yi Qian to walk over. His legs were inconvenient and he could no longer walk. He could only wait for the child to walk over on his own. Even though he did not know the child's name or where he had come from, he knew in his heart that this child was a child of the Fu family. He was a child of the Fu family. With just one look, he knew that this child was a child of the Fu family. "Don't stand on ceremony. Come over here and let Grandpa have a good look at you," the old man said kindly. Don't worry, don't worry. His good grandson had found his granddaughter. Don't worry, don't worry. He just stood here and waited for her to come home. His good grandson found his granddaughter. That's great. That's great. There was no sense of unfamiliarity or alienation. He stood there and made Yi Qian feel as if she had grown up by the old man's side. Every time she went on a long trip, the old man would use his walking stick to send her off. Every time she came home, he would use his walking stick to stand at the top of the stairs and wait for her to come home. Chapter 22:32. This was blood, this was family. No matter how long they had been separated, they would always feel a sense of familiarity with each other. The road was long and lonely. As the wanderer returned home, her tears were stained with tears. Yi Qian did not know why she was crying again. When she realized that she was crying, her face was already mottled with tears. She lifted her foot and took the first step, the second step. She stood on the 9th step and looked up at the old man who was waiting for her. She saw the tears in the old man's eyes and also saw the excitement under his kind smile. She walked up the steps step by step. The old man, who looked calm on the surface, did not wait for Yi Qian to reach him. He had already reached out his trembling hand until Yi Qian took the initiative to stand under his outstretched hand. He gently stroked Yi Qian's head and sighed. "Child, you're finally home." There was no need to verify anything. The blood that could never be severed had already told the old man that the child he was so familiar with was a child of the Fu family. Yi Qian, whose tears were streaming down her face, looked up at the tear-stained old man. After a while, she said softly, "It's cold outside. Let me help you into the house." Her words were short, but they were trembling. Okay. Let's talk inside, the white-haired old man repeated repeatedly as Yi Qian helped him into the house. Li Jinyan saw that Yi Qian was supporting his grandfather steadily, so he discreetly let go of his hand and allowed Yi Qian to help him into the house. He walked with Xia Jinyuan behind them. "Yi Qian is indeed my uncle's daughter. I'm sure of it." The old man and the young girl walked slowly in front of him. Li Jinyan's deep and gentle gaze was fixed on them. He said to Xia Jinyuan in a low voice, "My grandfather won't be wrong either. He has already decided that Yi Qian is his granddaughter, his only granddaughter." As far as he could remember, his grandfather had never shed tears in public. Even when his grandmother passed away and his mother passed away, his grandfather would only show his face after crying behind his back. He had never bowed down to fate and used his strong will to overcome difficulties time and time again. And Yi Qian's return made him cry tears of joy. Even though he was trying his best to hold back his tears, his eyes still glistened with tears. Xia Jinyuan was also happy for Yi Qian. Judging from the old man's reaction, he had already determined that Yi Jian was his granddaughter. The bloodline was indeed magical. Even though it was the first time they met, he also felt that Yi Jian was the old man's granddaughter. "I also believe in my intuition. However, old Mister's identity is special, so it's better to be cautious. The DNA test is indispensable." Looking at Yi Jian's back, Xia Jinyuan said calmly, "There are still many things that need to be sorted out. Let's go in first." Li Jinyan nodded. "You know more about Yi Jian's past than I do. It just so happens that I have a lot of questions to ask. But..." He paused for a few seconds before continuing, "We have to avoid my grandfather. I'm worried that he won't be able to accept it." He was referring to the difficult life Yi Qian had led in the past. Xia Jinyuan nodded in understanding. What kind of life little fox led in the past? He couldn't say it in front of the old man. He definitely wouldn't be able to accept it. Later, the old man will definitely ask about Yi Qian's past. With Yi Qian's kindness, she won't complain. She'll only say things that will make the old man feel better. But with the old man's wisdom, he'll definitely be able to tell that Yi Qian is coaxing him. Does the old man have any heart problems? If so, it's best to prepare the medicine first. Xia Jinyuan arranged everything carefully. Chapter 2233. The old man's heart was fine, but his blood pressure was unstable, and there was a blood clot in his brain. Li Jinyan paid close attention to him the entire time, afraid that his grandfather would be too agitated and cause problems. The heater was turned on, and it was warm and comfortable to walk in. The old man was supported by Yi Qian into the living room. He introduced the furniture in the living room in a hoarse voice. "This place was renovated according to my wishes by the state. There isn't a single nail in the furniture, and it's all made of mortise and tenon construction. Look at the wooden sofa, it's all handmade by an old carpenter. It's sturdy, durable, and much better than those leather sofas or fabric sofas outside. Do you see the curtains? They're made of cotton and linen. They weren't dyed with chemical dyes, but with ancient plants." There were so many things he wanted to say and ask, so much so that the old man didn't know where to start. He was so touched that he couldn't say a single word. He could only talk about the environment he was living in now. It could be seen that the state had meticulously arranged the old man's life in his later years. His food, clothing, housing, and transportation were all arranged according to the old man's wishes. From the large furniture to the small daily necessities, everything was arranged according to the old man's habits. The old man was born in a wealthy family. He was a rich young master who had maids and manservants to serve him. Before the age of 28, his life was exquisite. His food, clothing, housing, and transportation were all top-notch. Although he fell on hard times later on, the old man never gave up on life. He could live his life to his liking with just a bouquet of wild flowers, a wooden chair, a green bowl, and a pot of water. It was because the old man and the old madam were open-minded and never lost interest in life that they were able to survive one crisis after another. Even though he was old and retired, the old man still maintained his youthful attitude towards life. Yi Qian admired him. Everything in the house is what this old man likes. Later, I'll have Jinyan go out with you and buy some things that you girls like. Jinyan is your aunt's son. He's older than you, and he's your older brother. If you need anything in the future, you can look for him. The old man spoke very slowly, but he didn't stop for a moment. He wanted to chat with Yi Qian and get closer to Yi Qian. He wanted to make Yi Qian accept him as a grandfather who had never cared about her and didn't even know about her existence. He also kept holding Yi Qian's hand, as if he was afraid that he would lose it if he let go. Even when he was sitting on the sofa, he still held on to it tightly. Every time he spoke, he couldn't help but look at Yi Qian. He looked at him carefully, as if he was afraid that if he said too much, Yi Qian would get angry and leave. Yi Qian saw how careful the old man was. His nose was stuffed. Please take a rest first. I will accompany you. Holding the old man's skinny hands, Yi Qian said softly, I won't go anywhere. I'll stay here with you. The old man's shoulders trembled. His eyes, which were filled with wisdom and calmness, were filled with tears. He gripped Yi Qian's hand tightly. His chest heaved violently. Tell Grandpa your name, and how old are you this year? Which military school are you studying at now? How have you been all these years? Have you suffered a lot? Tell Grandpa all about it. Grandpa wants to know, wants to know. The old man's voice was choked with emotion. Li Jinyan's expression changed slightly. He hurriedly said, Please speak slowly. Yi Qian is here with you. Don't be so agitated. He then said to Yi Qian, Grandpa has a blood clot in his brain. He shouldn't be too agitated. Chapter 22:34. On the other side, Xia Jinyuan took the warm water from the housekeeper and handed it to Li Jinyan. Let old master drink some water and calm himself down before we talk. Don't worry, I won't go anywhere today. I'll be with you the whole time. Yi Qian was scared. He had a blood clot in his brain, which was called a cerebral thrombosis. With this disease, he should not be agitated and unstable. She hurriedly said something to reassure old Master Fu. Drink some water first. You can ask slowly, and I'll tell you slowly. For a long time, the Fu family had only been looking for martyr son Xueqing, but they didn't know that martyr son Xueqing had given birth to a daughter for Fu Yuxing. Now that Yi Qian, who resembled martyr son Xueqing, had suddenly appeared, old Master Fu, who had always been calm, was greatly agitated. Yi Qian waited for old Master Fu to calm down before replying softly, My name is Yi Qian. I'm 20 years old today. I'm a first-year commander student at the National University of Science and Technology. You can see that I'm doing well and haven't suffered much. I also know that you've been looking for my mother and have never given up. Thank you for always thinking of us. Thank you, Yi Qian said softly with sincere eyes, trying to make Old Master Fu feel better. Old Master Fu didn't believe her. With tears streaming down his face, he held his granddaughter's hand tightly. His voice was as heavy as a rock. How could you not have suffered? How could you not have suffered? Your mother was pregnant with you. In that era, it was a big deal to get pregnant out of wedlock. People would point fingers at you, but she was still able to give birth to you. Grandpa was late. Grandpa let you and your mother suffer. The Fu family has mistreated you and your mother. Old Master Fu blamed himself. In his life, he didn't let God down, he didn't let the earth down, and he didn't let the country down. The only thing that made him uneasy was his son's fiancée. An innocent girl and his son were about to get a marriage certificate, but his son was suddenly called back for a year of confinement. The family didn't receive any news, and by the time they found out, things had changed. Who would have thought that her daughter-in-law would actually be pregnant? In that era, having a child out of wedlock would cause one to be criticized and scolded by thousands of people. In that era, her daughter-in-law still managed to give birth to a child. It was clear how strong she was. This child was like her mother. She was young, but her gaze was firm and unyielding. Her back was even straighter, and she had the arrogance to compete with the wind and snow. This kind of arrogance was not something an ordinary person could possess. Only those who had suffered countless hardships, endured countless hardships, bravely faced them again and again, and defeated them again and again. In order to make him feel better, his granddaughter was comforting him. Yi Qian was also very sad, but more than that, she felt relieved. With tears in her eyes, she kept comforting the old man who was deeply immersed in self-blame. Don't blame yourself. You've already tried your best to find my mother. It's just that my mother's name isn't Hongmei. It's normal that you couldn't find her. Faced with the old man who was so deeply remorseful that his hands were trembling, Yi Qian didn't dare to mention that her mother had already sacrificed herself. She quickly changed the topic and talked about herself. I'm also doing very well. I'm really doing very well. I got into the school I like, and I'm doing very well. Don't be too sad. How could he not be sad? His only granddaughter had been exposed to the outside world, and the Fu family didn't know anything about it. She had suffered so much and suffered so much. How could this old man not be sad? Chapter 22:35. Now that his only granddaughter was back, Old Master Fu was more happy than sad. Good girl, this is the Fu family's good girl, even though life was tough when you were young, who didn't suffer at that time. Everyone was the same, so we didn't think it was tough. Also, compared to the life you had before, we didn't suffer at all. Don't cry anymore, it'll hurt your eyes if you cry too much. Indeed, Yi Qian only said nice things. She made light of the hardships she had suffered in Yi Jifan's house when she was young, which made the old man, who was as clear as a mirror, feel even more distressed. Old Master Fu, who had lost control of his emotions, looked at Yi Qian without blinking. Hearing her comforting words, not only did he not feel comfortable, but he felt even more sad. How could the Fu family be so blind? How could they let such a sensible child be pregnant? Fu Yuxing, you're such a bastard. How could you not realize that your fiancée is pregnant? Old Master Fu, who felt guilty, became angry again, which made Li Jinyan, who was standing next to him, so worried that he secretly clenched his fists. Especially when he saw Old Master Fu turn away, tears streaming down his face. His eyes were red. Li Jinyan gently stroked Old Master Fu's back from behind. You should rest for a while. If you cry, Yi Qian will cry too. Facing old Master Fu, who was sad and blaming himself, old Master Fu's stooped figure made Yi Qian feel so sad that she felt uneasy. Clenching old Master Fu's skinny hands that had never let go of her for a second, Yi Qian said softly, "Grandpa, let's not cry anymore." He had thought that it would be difficult to say the words, "Grandpa," but when he actually said it, he realized that it was actually very simple. Before old Master Fu could react, Yi Qian said again, "Grandpa, if you continue to cry, I won't dare to talk to you anymore." The two heartfelt "Grandpa" finally made the old man come back to his senses. He was too shocked and too excited. The two "Grandpa" finally broke the last bit of distance between the grandfather and grandson. There was no longer any sense of unfamiliarity. Good, good, good. Countless goods came out of the old man's mouth. Grandpa, this child called him Grandpa. How could this child's heart be so pure and kind? How could he forgive this rotten old man so easily? Good child, don't be afraid that Grandpa will be sad. Grandpa knows that you're just trying to coax me and make me feel better. Grandpa can't take back all the pain you've suffered in the past, but in the future, Grandpa won't let you suffer alone anymore. If there's anything, let's face it together. Also, wait for your father to come back and make him apologize to you properly. It was all his fault back then, but you, a child, had to suffer. No, he still has to apologize to your mother. As a man, he didn't protect his wife and daughter well. He deserves to be beaten. He deserves to be scolded. 20 years. It's been 20 years since Grandpa found out about your existence. Child, if there's anything you're unhappy about, tell Grandpa. This is what Grandpa deserves. I'm really not unhappy about anything. Please don't think too much about it. What happened back then? Yi Qian looked at Li Jinyan, who was worried about the old man's health. She wondered if she should call him a brother. So be it. The Devil King was her brother after all. Li Jinyan, who had been listening by the side, saw that she didn't say anything. Instead, she looked at him. He seemed to have guessed something and smiled. He waited for Yi Qian to speak again. Chapter 22:36. Yi Qian's gaze swept across his face, but she did not call him brother immediately. The Devil King was her team leader during her training. She had been scolded, yelled at, and scolded by him. The cold image of the Devil King had long been engraved in her mind. Suddenly calling him a brother made her feel indescribably awkward. The old master, who was immersed in grief, noticed Yi Qian's slight pause. The clear-minded old man understood everything, but he could not say it. He could not force his granddaughter, who had only returned home after 20 years, to acknowledge him as her father. He could not, and did not dare to. Today, she had already given him a huge surprise by calling him Grandpa. Now, he needed time to adjust their relationship. Good child, the Fu family was not kind enough to let your mother suffer. It was all our fault, all our fault. The old master did not want his granddaughter, who had finally returned home, to feel sad. With a solemn expression on his deeply wrinkled face, he said to Yi Qian, "A mistake is a mistake. No matter how much time has passed, this mistake must be acknowledged. Although the past was in the past, the damage left behind would not disappear because of it. Mistakes must be corrected, and they must be corrected properly." Yi Qian gently shook his head and comforted the old man. "I know what happened back then. Grandpa, you were not wrong. My mother was not wrong either. And my father was not wrong either. None of you were wrong. The mistake was that the timing was not right. The mistake was that fate made a fool of us. Don't worry, I really don't have any resentment. In the past, to be honest, I did hate, but now I don't. I know that you have always been looking for my mother. I know that my grandmother and aunt still miss my mother when they passed away. I also know that my father did not remarry because of my mother. What else do I have to hate? No, really no. It's not that you don't want my mother and me, it's just that we missed each other. I don't hate, I only feel happy now. I never thought that I would have a grandfather, a father, and a family whose blood is thicker than water. I really never thought, but now I have them all. I really don't have any hatred, no resentment, only happiness. Grandpa, I am happy, very, very happy. As Yi Qian spoke, the tears that he had tried so hard to stop started flowing again. 2 lifetimes. She had used 2 lifetimes to have a close relative whose blood was thicker than water. Only then did she have a family that she truly loved. This time, the tears that flowed down her face were no longer filled with sadness. Instead, they were filled with genuine joy. She was really, really happy. When she cried, the old man could not control the grief in his heart. His wise eyes, which had seen the world through hardships, were filled with tears. He held Yi Qian's hand tightly and said in a trembling voice, good child, Grandpa thanks you, Grandpa thanks you. She was kind and righteous. It was all thanks to her mother's good upbringing that he was able to meet his only granddaughter. In the future, when he was in the underworld, he could happily tell the old woman that she had a good granddaughter, a very, very good granddaughter. The old man and the young woman started crying again. They could not stop crying at all. Li Jinyan gave Xia Jinyuan a look, indicating for him to comfort Yi Qian. He then advised the old man, Grandpa, if you continue crying, I will have to call the doctor. On the other side, Xia Jinyuan gently comforted Yi Qian, the old man's health is not good. Your crying will make him even sadder. Little fox, today is a good day. Let's not cry so much. We should smile more. Chapter 22:37. He was also afraid that Yi Qian would keep crying. Crying too much was not a good thing. It was bad for both the body and the mind. Xia Jinyuan, who felt sorry for his lover, said in a softer voice, just now, the devil was eagerly waiting for you to call him a brother. In the end, he didn't hear you call him a brother. Instead, he saw you crying with the old man. That won't do. Crying too much is bad for the body. It's fine if you're young, but not the old man. Now that you have a grandfather and a family, I think you also wish for your grandfather to live a long life. The last sentence was the most effective. It stopped Yi Qian from crying. Yi Qian, who was crying so much that her breathing became unstable, was comforted by Xia Jinyuan. The urge to cry in her heart gradually subsided. When she finally stopped crying, Yi Qian had a helpless look on her face. Today, she had cried a little too much. She had gone overboard. She cried for no reason and couldn't control herself at all. Her tears flowed like a waterfall. She had clearly cried all her grievances away, so why did she start crying again just now? She was like a child. Xia Jinyuan reached out to wipe away the tears on her face. Seeing that she was crying so hard that her eyes resembled a rabbit's and her breathing was uneven, Xia Jinyuan, who was comforting her, patted her back with heartache. He picked up a cup of warm water from the coffee table and said, drink some water before you talk to the old man. Also, look at Li Jinyan. He's waiting for you to call him brother. In the army, he's the devil and the leader of the soldiers, but at home, he's just your family. He's your brother. What's so difficult about it? Let me say it. It's not a loss for you to call him brother. In the future, you'll have another family member who will protect you and love you dearly. Isn't that a good thing? The old man, who had been comforting Yi Qian, used his handkerchief to wipe the corners of his eyes. When he heard this young man, who he didn't know, speak like this, he couldn't help but take a second look at him. The young man had been quietly accompanying them and had not paid attention to what he was saying since he entered the room. Now that he had opened his mouth, he was speaking up for the Fu family. Looking at his granddaughter, she was also willing to listen to his advice. It was obvious that their relationship was not ordinary. The old man looked at Xia Jinyuan gratefully. Although he did not say anything, it was enough to make Xia Jinyuan happy. It meant that he had left a good first impression on the old man. Since Xia Jinyuan valued Yi Qian, he naturally valued Yi Qian's family as well. Li Jinyan, who had persuaded the old man, had mixed feelings. The word brother was also quite unfamiliar to him. Although he was the eldest grandson of the Li family and had several younger brothers and sisters, they had been estranged from each other since childhood and did not have many deep feelings for each other. He did not expect his stepmother's son and daughter to be close to him. He only hoped that they would not harm him. As for calling him a brother, he did not expect them to be close to him. The children of the Li family were born with the cold blood of the Li family. Today, old man Li was able to control all of the family business in his hands. His hands were stained with the lives of his brothers. In old man Li's words, the children of his wife were not considered part of the Li family, but they could be the dogs of the Li family for the rest of their lives. The Li family was a warlord. His great-grandfather married a total of 12 concubines. Except for old man Li, who was born to the first wife, the other 16 children were born to the 12 concubines. However, in the end, only the first wife, who was his great-grandmother, survived. Survival of the fittest was the Li family's ancestral teaching. Whoever survived was qualified to be the next heir of the Li family. Today, old man Li survived by stepping on the bones of his family. Chapter 2238. Li Jinyan's lips twitched coldly. He had never thought of finding kinship in the Li family. The Li family did not give him a sense of kinship, but the Fu family had made him feel warm since he was young. The Li family did not give him a sense of belonging, so the Fu family, which had few members, was his home. Now that the family was reunited, as an older brother, he finally had a younger sister. He was just waiting for her to speak. Older brother, just thinking about hearing Yi Qian call out to him in a soft voice, Li Jinyan's cold expression softened. There was even a flicker of light in his cold eyes. The devil, who was usually calm and composed, was a little excited. He would work hard to be Yi Qian's good older brother. He would make her trust him wholeheartedly in the future. He would support her and shelter her from the wind and rain. He would give her the best of everything. Being an older brother was a kind of responsibility. He would work hard to fulfill this responsibility to the fullest. Li Jinyan, who was waiting for Yi Qian to call him older brother, couldn't help but sit up straighter. His heart was beating faster and faster, and he was a little nervous. His gaze was dark as he waited for Yi Qian to speak. Old Master Fu's emotions had calmed down. Seeing Yi Qian looking behind him, old Master Fu gently patted the back of Yi Qian's hand and said amiably, "Child, you and your older brother must be well in the future. Only when you are well will I be able to rest assured. He is your older brother, your dearest older brother." Yes, the devil was her older brother. He would be her dearest older brother. She could call him that openly. Just as Captain Xia had said, he was the devil, the leader of the soldiers in the army. But at home, he was only her family. He was her older brother. Why couldn't she say it? Since Grandpa had already spoken, how could she go against his wishes and disappoint him? The atmosphere was tense enough, so it was better to talk about something more relaxing. Thinking of this, Yi Qian, whose eyes were red, looked at Li Jinyan with a smile. Under the old man's expectant gaze, her dimples bloomed like a flower. She said sweetly, "Brother, please take care of me in the future." The sweet, big brother not only made the old man happy, but it also made the calm Li Jinyan's heart tremble. It was as if he could hear the sound of flowers blooming in his ears. Why did I feel a sense of familiarity when I first saw Yi Qian? Because blood is thicker than water. Why was it that when he saw Yi Qian, he only wanted to get close to her and look at her? Because she was his sister, his only sister. With me here, no one can bully you, including him. The demon king of sister spoiling was officially on the job, and he quickly made a list of all the rules that an older brother should protect his younger sister. After saying that, his cold gaze swept towards Xia Jinyuan. Then, he couldn't help but smile. If he dares to do anything to you, I'll teach him a lesson. Yi Qian was instantly amused. She laughed out loud. She looked at Captain Xia, who was sitting upright and still. Then, she looked at Li Jinyan and said in a crisp voice, "Then I'll have to trouble you in the future, brother." "It's no trouble. It's what I should do." Li Jinyan, who was answering seriously, glanced at Xia Jinyuan. When he retracted his gaze, a cold light flashed in his dark eyes. The first thing he had to do was to discuss with him not to hug his sister all the time. The smile on Yi Qian's face deepened. It felt good to have a brother protecting her. Chapter 2239. Ever since she was young, she had always envied the children in the village who had older siblings. Every time they were bullied by other children, the first ones to stand up for them would not be their parents, but their older siblings. They would protect their younger siblings like a mother hen protecting her chicks. At that time, she was especially envious of them. Later on, when Ying was bullied by other children, she still foolishly rushed up to protect her. In the end, when she returned to the Yi family, what she received was not praise, but a beating and scolding. Ying complained to Sun Dongqing, saying that Sun Dongqing and the other children in the village bullied her and even helped the children hit her. Since then, Sun Dongqing had never done such a stupid thing as protecting Ying as an older sister. However, in her heart, she still hoped that she would have an older brother or sister to protect her. She naively thought that one day, an older brother or sister would appear and block Sun Dongqing's scolding and beating for her. Her naive and silly childhood dream suddenly came true one day. The older brother, who walked in front of her, was a special forces soldier who could take on 10 people by himself. Yi Qian felt that by calling him older brother, she had actually taken advantage of him. Xia Jinyuan, who had received 2 consecutive glances, glanced at Li Jinyan, his eyelids twitching uncontrollably. A brother-in-law was a creature that either ignored everything or was reasonable in everything. Just by looking at his expression, Xia Jinyuan knew that he was a brother-in-law who was reasonable in everything. With a brother-in-law who was reasonable in everything, his life would not be easy. It did not matter, as long as Little Fox's life was good and she was happy. Moreover, Li Jinyan, this brother-in-law, was not at home all year round. When he returned to the capital, Little Fox might not return. One was in the navy, and the other was in the army. They would not be able to see each other often. Even if his brother-in-law was reasonable in everything, they would only see each other for a few days. As for Xia Jinyuan, he would just have to bear with it. With that thought, Xia Jinyuan immediately let out a long sigh of relief. He did not disturb the old man's family reunion and continued to sit quietly by the side. His eyes were filled with encouragement as he gently gazed at Yi Qian. The old man also noticed that something was amiss. His originally kind gaze instantly turned sharp as it fell on the young man whom he had only briefly glanced at earlier. He was a major and had good looks. His facial features were well defined. His eyes were not bad either. He had military might and righteousness. His height was about the same as his grandson's. He was tall and straight. Judging from his appearance, he was a good young man. Seeing that the old man was sizing him up, Xia Jinyuan, who had been sitting upright, smiled politely at the old man and gracefully allowed the old man to look at him. This time, it was as if he was accompanying the little fox back to her parents' home, while he himself was visiting the Yu clan. The only mistake he made was that he did not bring any gifts to visit them. The old man liked young people who were bright, intelligent, and as bright as the moon. Seeing Xia Jinyuan's neither servile nor overbearing attitude, he couldn't help but secretly nod his head. The oppressive and sorrowful atmosphere instantly relaxed when Yi Qian called him a brother. The old man, who blamed himself for not knowing that he had a granddaughter for more than 20 years, placed Li Jinyan's hand on top of Yi Qian's and said earnestly, "The two of you are very close. As an older brother, you should know how to give in to each other and protect your younger sister. As a younger sister, you should know how to be considerate of your older brother and take care of him more. One of you is from the Navy, while the other is from the Army. It's not easy for you to meet each other. If you have time, write to each other more often and get to know each other, okay? What's the most important thing for a family? The most important thing is to think about each other, care for each other, and not drift apart. Once you drift apart, your feelings will fade. When you want to find each other again, no matter how hard you try, there will always be a ravine in the end." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.